Welcome. The night has fallen, and the world is quiet. Lean back, close your eyes, and take a deep breath. You are listening to NightSleepWhisper. Tonight, I will take you to the peaks of the frozen mountains, to the halls of the Iron Gate fortress where the wind howls outside. In this 50-chapter journey, we will follow the path of Sir Alistair. The hearth is warm, the snow is falling. If you are ready, our story begins. Sir Alistair sat on his large black horse. The wind was very strong and very cold. The snow fell from the dark sky like thick white feathers. He could not see the road clearly because of the storm. He pulled his heavy wool cloak closer to his body. His fingers were frozen, and his face was red. He looked up and saw the Iron Gate fortress. It was a giant castle made of grey stone. It sat high on a hill, looking down at the forest. Alistair was a royal investigator. He worked for the king. The king was a good man, but he was worried. He heard stories about strange things happening at the Iron Gate. He told Alistair to go there and find the truth. Alistair was a brave man with short brown hair and sharp green eyes. He was 40 years old and very intelligent. Alistair reached the main gate of the castle. The heavy iron bars looked very strong and dangerous. 2 guards stood at the entrance. They held long, sharp spears. Their metal armor was wet from the melting snow. 1 guard stepped forward and blocked the path. "Who are you? Why are you here in this storm?" the guard asked. His voice was loud. Alistair did not look afraid. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a gold ring. The ring had the king's mark on it, a lion with a crown. "I am Sir Alistair," he said clearly. "The king sent me to speak with Lord Cedric." The guards looked at the gold ring. They looked at each other and nodded. They turned a large wheel, and the heavy iron gate rose slowly. Alistair rode his horse into the courtyard. The ground was covered in slippery ice and mud. A servant ran to him and took the horse's rope. Alistair walked toward the large wooden doors of the main hall. He pushed the doors open. Inside, the room was very large and very dark. The only light came from a massive fireplace. The wood burned with a bright orange light. The air smelled like smoke and cooked meat. Lord Cedric stood in the middle of the room. He was a tall man with long grey hair and a very long beard. He wore a dark blue robe with expensive fur around the neck. He looked very tired. His eyes were small and worried. "Sir Alistair," Lord Cedric said. His voice was deep and slow. "You arrived during a terrible storm. Please, come near the fire and warm yourself." Alistair walked to the fireplace. He felt the heat on his frozen face. "Thank you, my lord," Alistair said. "The journey was difficult. The king is concerned about the Iron Gate. He hears that the peace here is broken." Lord Cedric looked at the floor. He did not speak for a long time. Then he looked at Alistair. "There is a shadow over this house. Sir Alistair, I am glad you are here. We have many secrets to discuss. But first, you must eat and rest." Alistair looked around the great hall. The shadows of the fire moved on the walls like ghosts. He felt that someone was watching him from the dark balcony above. He looked up quickly, but he saw no one. He knew his work was just beginning. The dining hall was a very long room with high stone walls. Large candles stood in heavy metal holders on the table. The yellow light of the candles made long, jumping shadows on the floor. A very long wooden table sat in the center of the room. It was covered with a white cloth, but the cloth was old and stained. Sir Alistair sat to the right of Lord Cedric. He watched the other people enter the room. First came Lady Alara. She was a tall woman with very pale skin and dark hair. She wore a long dress made of green silk. She did not smile when she saw Alistair. She sat down across from him and looked at her plate. Next was Brother Thomas. He was a small man with a bald head and a kind face. He wore a simple brown robe with a rope around his waist. He walked slowly and kept his hands inside his sleeves. He nodded to Alistair but did not say a word. Finally, Captain Marek arrived. He was a large, strong man with a scarred face. He wore a leather vest and a heavy sword at his side. He sat down heavily. He looked at Alistair with suspicion. He did not seem happy to have a visitor from the king. Servants brought large platters of food. There was roasted chicken, thick bread, and bowls of soup. They also poured dark red wine into silver cups. The smell of the food was good, but no one seemed hungry. The meal began in total silence. The only sounds in the room were the metal forks hitting the plates and the soft movement of the servants. The fire in the fireplace continued to burn, and a piece of wood broke. Alistair looked at the faces around the table. The Iron Gate is a very famous fortress. Alistair said. He wanted to break the silence. The king says it is the strongest castle in the north. Captain Marek looked up from his soup. It was strong. He said. His voice was like gravel. But stone can break. And men can be weak. Lady Alara looked at the captain. Her hand moved to her throat, and she touched a silver necklace. The captain is tired. She said softly to Alistair. The winter is long, and we are all very lonely here. Are there many problems in the village? Alistair asked Brother Thomas. The monk looked up slowly. The people are hungry. Sir Alistair. They pray for a good harvest. But the ground is frozen. I do what I can to help them with medicine and prayer. Lord Cedric did not eat. He picked up his silver cup and took a long drink of wine. His hand was shaking. He looked at Alistair, and for a moment, Alistair saw pure fear in the old man's eyes. Cedric started to speak, but he stopped and coughed. We will talk more tomorrow. Lord Cedric said. He stood up slowly. The night is late. Sleep well. Sir Alistair. The castle is safe tonight. Alistair watched them leave the room one by one. He did not feel safe. He felt like he was in a room full of people with many secrets. The sun rose slowly the next morning, but the sky stayed a dull grey. The snow did not stop. Sir Alistair woke up early. His room was very cold, and the fire in his small fireplace was now only grey ash. He put on his heavy leather boots and his wool tunic. He felt a strange nervousness in his stomach. He walked down the long stone stairs to the dining hall for breakfast. Lady Alara was already there. She sat near the window and watched the falling snow. Her face looked very pale in the morning light. Brother Thomas arrived a moment later. He looked tired, as if he did not sleep at all. Captain Marek stood near the door. He was cleaning a small spot of rust from his metal glove. The large chair at the head of the long table was empty. Lord Cedric was not there. They waited for 15 minutes. Then they waited for 30 minutes. The servants brought hot bread and porridge, but no one started to eat. The food grew cold, and a thin layer of skin formed on top of the porridge. My father is never late for breakfast, Lady Alara said. Her voice was thin and sharp. She stood up and smoothed her green dress. He is a man of many habits. This is not right. Perhaps he is just tired from the storm. Brother Thomas said softly. He tried to smile, but his eyes stayed worried. No. Captain Marek said. He put his metal glove on the table. I will go to his room. Sir Alistair, please come with me. Alistair followed the captain up the stairs to the highest part of the castle. They walked through a narrow hallway. The walls were lined with old paintings of former lords. They reached a thick oak door. This was Lord Cedric's private chamber. Captain Marek knocked on the wood. A hollow sound echoed in the quiet hallway. There was no answer. He knocked again, much harder this time. Lord Cedric. It is Marek. The sun is up. Everyone is waiting. There was only silence from behind the door. Alistair reached out and turned the iron handle. It did not move. He pushed against the wood. But it was solid. The door is locked from the inside. Alistair said. He looked at the floor. There was no gap under the door. Move back. Marek ordered. The big man stepped back and then ran forward. He hit the door with his shoulder. A loud cracking sound filled the air. He hit it a second time, and the wooden frame broke. The door swung open and hit the wall. The room was very dark because the heavy velvet curtains were closed. Alistair walked inside. The air smelled strange. It was a sweet, sharp smell, like bitter almonds. He walked to the large bed. Lord Cedric lay on his back. His eyes were wide open and staring at the ceiling. His mouth was open as if he wanted to scream. His skin was a cold, blue color. Alistair put 2 fingers on the Lord's neck. There was no movement. He is dead. Alistair said quietly. Lady Alara stood at the broken door. She made a soft sound of pain and covered her face with her hands. Alistair looked around the room. The windows were shut and locked with iron bars. There was no other door. The room was a perfect box, locked from the inside. Yet, the Lord of the Iron Gate was dead. Sir Alistair stood very still in the center of the room. The air was cold, but the smell of bitter almonds was still very strong. It was a sharp smell that made his nose sting. He looked at Lord Cedric's face again. The old man's eyes were white and empty. Do not touch anything, Alistair said to Captain Marek. His voice was firm. We must look at this room very carefully. Lady Alara stayed by the broken door. She did not enter the room. Her hands were shaking, and her face was as white as the snow outside. She looked at her father and then looked away. This is impossible, she whispered. The door was locked. The windows are locked. How did this happen? Alistair did not answer her yet. He walked slowly toward a large desk made of dark oak wood. The desk was near the fireplace. There were many papers on the desk. Some papers were open, and some were rolled into tight tubes. There was a small glass bottle of black ink and a long white feather for writing. Alistair looked at a small wooden box on the corner of the desk. The box was open. It was lined with red velvet, but the box was empty. Alistair felt a cold sensation in his chest. Captain Marek, he said. Come here. Look at this box. The captain walked over. His heavy boots made a dull sound on the stone floor. He looked into the empty red velvet box. His eyes grew wide. The king's golden seal. Marek said. His voice was low and full of fear. It was there last night. I saw Lord Cedric put it inside before he went to sleep. Are you sure? Alistair asked. I am very sure. Marek replied. The Lord always kept the seal in that box. It is the most important object in the Iron Gate. Without that seal, no message from this castle is official. A person with that seal can write a letter and say it is from the king. Alistair looked around the floor near the desk. He did not see any gold. He did not see anything shiny. He saw a small drop of black ink on the white rug. The ink was dry, but it was in a strange place. It was far away from the desk. Someone took the seal, Alistair said. And they took it while the door was locked. But there is no one here. Lady Alara cried from the doorway. Look at the room. Sir Alistair. There is no place to hide. The chimney is too small for a man. The windows are solid. My father was alone. Alistair walked to the windows. He pushed against the glass. The metal bars were strong and did not move. He looked at the floor again. There were no footprints in the dust. The seal is gone, and a good man is dead. Alistair said, "This is not just a death. This is a crime against the king. If the seal is in the wrong hands, it can start a war between our lands and the south." He looked at Marek and Ilara. "No one leaves this castle." Alistair ordered. "The mystery of the locked room is now a hunt for a thief and a killer." Sir Alistair knelt by the bed. The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind blew against the heavy stone walls. Lord Cedric lay on the soft white pillows. His eyes were wide and fixed on a spot on the ceiling. Alistair reached out and touched the man's hand. The skin was as cold as ice. The fingers were stiff and did not move. "There is no blood," Captain Marek said. He stood behind Alistair. His hand was on the hilt of his long sword. "How can a man die with no blood and no wounds?" "It is like magic." Alistair did not answer. He moved the heavy wool blanket. He looked at the Lord's chest and neck very carefully. There were no marks from a dagger. There were no purple bruises from a pair of strong hands. The Lord's nightgown was clean and straight. It did not look like he fought with an attacker. There was no struggle in this bed. He did not fight. Alistair said softly. He did not even move from his pillow. Alistair leaned closer to Lord Cedric's face. He took a slow breath through his nose. The smell of bitter almonds was very powerful here. It was sweet and heavy. It did not belong in a bedroom. It belonged in a shop of dangerous medicines or a garden of secret plants. "Brother Thomas," Alistair called out. The small monk stepped into the room. He kept his head low and his hands hidden in his brown sleeves. He looked at the body and made a sign of the cross over his chest. "Yes, Sir Alistair. You are a man of medicine." Alistair said, "Tell me about this smell. It is like almonds, but it is too sharp. It stings my nose." Brother Thomas walked to the bed. He sniffed the air and then moved back quickly. His face turned a dull grey color. "This is a very dark thing, Sir Alistair. It is the scent of the crushed seeds of a wild fruit. If a man drinks even a small drop, his heart stops. He cannot breathe. He dies in seconds. It is a very fast poison." Alistair looked at the small wooden table next to the bed. There was a silver cup. It was empty. He picked up the cup carefully by the base. He held it up to the light of the window. At the bottom of the cup, there was a tiny bit of clear liquid. He smelled the cup. The scent was there, too. It was much stronger inside the metal cup. He drank it. Alistair said. Lord Cedric drank this poison in his wine. But the door was locked. The windows are solid. Who gave him the cup? Alistair looked at the floor around the table. He saw a small, wet spot on the rug. It was near the leg of the table. He touched it with his finger. It was sticky and cold. The killer was here. Alistair whispered to himself. They were in this room. They watched him die. But how did they leave a locked room? He looked at the Lord's mouth again. The lips were a dark purple color. The Lord's face showed great surprise. He did not expect to die. He trusted the person who gave him the drink. Alistair stood up and looked at the people in the room. One of them was a murderer. One of them had the golden seal. I need to talk to everyone. Alistair said. One by one. Lady Ilara, you are first. We will go to the small library. The small library was a quiet room on the second floor. It was much smaller than the great hall. The walls were covered with shelves made of dark wood. Thousands of old books and scrolls sat on the shelves. The room smelled like dry paper and old dust. A single candle burned on a small table in the center. The light was weak and orange. Sir Alistair sat in a hard wooden chair. He looked at Lady Alara. She sat across from him. She was still wearing her green silk dress, but she had a black shawl over her shoulders. Her eyes were red from crying, and her face was very pale. She did not look at Alistair. She looked at the small flame of the candle. Lady Alara. Alistair began softly. I know this is a very difficult time. You lost your father, but I must ask you some questions. I need to find the truth. Alara nodded slowly. I understand. Sir Alistair, my father loved this castle. He loved the king. I want to know who killed him. Tell me about last night. Alistair said. When was the last time you saw Lord Cedric? We had dinner together, as you saw. She replied. Her voice was thin. After dinner, he went to his room. He said he had a lot of work to do. He wanted to look at some maps and the golden seal. He seemed very tired, but he was not sick. Did he speak to anyone else? Alistair asked. I do not know. Alara said. She reached out and touched the edge of the table. Her hands were shaking. I went to my own room. I read a book and then I went to sleep. I did not hear anything during the night. The walls of this castle are very thick. Alistair watched her closely. He noticed that she was moving her right hand strangely. She kept pulling the long sleeve of her dress down over her wrist. She seemed very nervous about her sleeve. Did your father have any enemies? Alistair asked. He leaned forward a little bit. Everyone has enemies in these times. Alara said. Other lords want our land. They want the Iron Gate because it is a strong position. But no one inside the castle would hurt him. Everyone loved him. Alistair did not think she was telling the whole truth. He looked at her arm again. For a short second, the sleeve of her dress moved up. Alistair saw a small corner of white paper. It was a letter, and she was hiding it inside her sleeve. Is there anything else you want to tell me? Alistair asked. He did not mention the letter yet. He wanted to see if she would tell him about it. Alara pulled her sleeve down again. She gripped her arm tightly. No, Sir Alistair. There is nothing else. I only want to go to my room and pray. You may go, Alistair said. He stood up and walked to the door. But please, stay inside the castle. Do not go to the village. Lady Alara stood up and walked past him. She moved very quickly. The heavy wooden door closed. Alistair stood alone in the library. He knew Lady Alara was hiding a secret. Why did she have a secret letter? And who was the letter from? He needed to find out, but first, he had to talk to the others. Sir Alistair walked down a narrow, dark staircase. The air became warmer and thicker. He smelled roasted meat, onions, and dried herbs. He reached the bottom of the stairs and entered the castle kitchen. It was a very large room with a low ceiling. Huge iron pots hung from the stone walls. In the center of the room, there was a massive wooden table. It was covered with flour and vegetable skins. A woman stood by the table. She was a large woman with grey hair tied back in a tight knot. Her face was red from the heat of the ovens. This was Martha, the head cook. She was peeling a large pile of potatoes. Her hands moved quickly, but her eyes were red and wet. She was crying. Good morning, Martha, Alistair said gently. The woman jumped in surprise. The small knife in her hand hit the wooden table. She wiped her eyes with her white apron and looked at Alistair. Oh, Sir Alistair, you scared me. It is a very dark day for the Iron Gate. Yes, it is. Alistair agreed. He walked closer to the table. Lord Cedric was a good man. I want to find the person who hurt him. Can I ask you some questions about last night? Martha nodded. She put the knife down and leaned against the table. He was a wonderful lord. He always said thank you for his meals. Not like the others. Who prepared his wine last night? Alistair asked. I did, sir. Martha replied. I always prepare the Lord's evening tray. I put a fresh loaf of bread, some cheese, and a silver cup of red wine on a wooden tray. I left it here on the table at 8 o'clock. Did you take the tray to his room? Martha shook her head. No, sir. I was very busy with the big dinner for the guests. I told the young servant boy to take it, but he was helping Captain Marek in the stables. So, I left the tray here. When I looked again 10 minutes later, the tray was gone. I thought a servant took it up. Alistair looked at the empty space on the table. So, the tray sat here alone for 10 minutes. Anyone could walk through this kitchen. Yes. Martha said. The kitchen is always busy. People come and go. Guards, servants, even the monk comes here for water. Alistair looked around the room. There was a back door that led to the hallway near the Lord's stairs. Did you see anything strange last night? Anything at all? Martha looked nervous. She looked at the door and then back at Alistair. She lowered her voice. I stayed late to clean the pots. It was very late, maybe midnight. I heard a soft movement in the hallway outside. I looked out the door. I saw a shadow. A shadow? Alistair asked. What did it look like? It was a tall shadow. Martha whispered. The person wore a long, dark cloak with a hood. I could not see a face. The shadow moved very quickly and very quietly toward the Lord's stairs. There was no light, only the moon through the small window. Did the shadow carry anything? I think so. Martha said. The person held something small and shiny in their hand. It looked like metal. Then the shadow disappeared into the darkness. Alistair thanked Martha and walked out of the kitchen. He thought about the tall shadow and the shiny object. Was it the golden seal? Or was it the silver cup full of poison? He needed to find out who owned a dark cloak with a hood. In this castle, almost everyone did. Sir Alistair walked back to the library. The room was very quiet and smelled like old paper. Brother Thomas sat at a small wooden desk near the back. He had a very large book in front of him. The pages were yellow and very thin. The monk held a small candle to see the words. He did not look up when Alistair entered. Brother Thomas. Alistair said. I have more questions for you. The monk slowly closed the book. The heavy cover made a soft thud on the desk. He looked at Alistair with tired eyes. I am a man of peace. Sir Alistair. I only want to help the soul of Lord Cedric. How can I help you find the truth? Where were you last night? Alistair asked. Tell me exactly where you went after the meal. I was in the chapel for 2 hours. The monk replied. Then I came here to the library. I spent the rest of the night reading the old books. I prayed for the winter to end. I did not leave this room until the sun came up and the servants started their work. Alistair walked around the desk. He looked at the books on the shelves. Then he looked down at the floor. The library floor was made of clean grey stone. But under the monk's chair, there was something different. There were small pieces of dark, wet earth. Alistair looked at the monk's boots. They were made of simple brown leather. But the boots were not clean. They were covered in thick, fresh mud. The mud was dark and still a little bit wet. It is a very snowy day. Alistair said. He pointed to the boots. The ground outside is white with snow. But your boots are covered in dark mud. There is no mud in the chapel. There is no mud in the library. Where did this mud come from? Brother Thomas. The monk looked down at his feet. His face turned a light pink color. He pulled his long brown robe down to hide the boots. His hands started to shake. I went to the garden. He said quickly. I needed some herbs for a sick person in the village. The garden is very muddy under the snow because of the heat from the kitchen walls. In the middle of a storm. In the dark of night. Alistair asked. He stepped closer. The wind was very strong last night. Why did you go out then? The plants do not wait for the sun. Thomas said. He gripped his hands together inside his sleeves. The people in the village are very sick. I must help them. It is my duty. Alistair remembered the devil's breath flower. That flower grew in the castle garden. It was a plant for medicine, but it was also a plant for poison. The smell of the Lord's room was very similar to the seeds of that plant. The kitchen cook saw a shadow last night. Alistair said. A tall shadow in a dark cloak. Do you have a dark cloak? Brother Thomas. All monks have dark cloaks. Sir Alistair. We wear them to stay warm. It is not a crime to wear a cloak in a cold castle. Alistair nodded. That is true. But it is strange to go to the garden in a blizzard. Please, stay in the castle for now. I will talk to you again soon. Alistair turned and walked toward the door. He did not believe the monk. The mud was a sign. The monk was outside in the dark. Maybe he was not praying. Maybe he was looking for something, or hiding something. Sir Alistair needed to think. He left the library and walked toward the high tower. This was the tallest part of the Iron Gate fortress. The stone stairs were narrow and moved in a tight circle. The air was very thin and very cold here. His breath made small white clouds in front of his face. Every step he took made a dull sound against the old stone. He reached the top of the tower. There was a small, round room. It was used by the guards to look at the forest and the road. The room was empty now. The wind pushed against the thick walls, and the whole tower felt like it was shaking. Alistair looked at the floor. He saw something shiny near the wall. He knelt down and picked up a small piece of glass. It was clear and sharp. He looked up at the wall. There was a very small window high up. It was a circular window, no bigger than a man's head. The glass in the window was gone. Alistair stood on a wooden crate to see the window better. The iron lock on the window was bent. It was a strong lock, but someone used a heavy tool to break it. The small pieces of glass made a sharp noise under his heavy boots as he moved. This is very strange. Alistair said to himself. The window was far too small for a man to climb through. Even a very thin person could not fit his shoulders through that space. But the lock was broken from the outside. He could see the marks on the metal. Something or someone had forced the window open from the cold air outside the castle. He looked out through the broken window. The drop to the ground was very long. It was a wall of smooth grey stone with no places to hold on. A person could not climb this wall. It was impossible. He looked at the stone frame of the window. He found a tiny piece of black thread caught on a sharp corner of the stone. He pulled the thread away and looked at it in the light. It was high-quality wool, very strong and very dark. It did not look like the rough wool of a servant's clothes. It looked like the expensive clothes of a noble or a knight. Alistair thought about the locked room where Lord Cedric died. If someone could enter this tower through a tiny window, perhaps they had a way to move through the castle that no one knew about. He heard a soft movement behind him. He turned around quickly. The room was empty, but the heavy wooden door was now slightly open. It was closed when he arrived. The wind did not open it. The door was too heavy for the wind. Someone was watching him. Someone was following him into the highest parts of the castle. Alistair touched the handle of his dagger. He walked to the door and looked into the dark hallway of the stairs. He saw nothing but shadows. The fortress was full of eyes, and the killer was becoming bold. Sir Alistair walked down the narrow stairs of the high tower. His heart beat fast. He felt the cold air on his neck. Every shadow looked like a person. Every corner looked like a hiding place. He kept his hand on his sword. He did not see anyone in the hallway, but he felt a pair of eyes on his back. The fortress was too quiet. It was a silence that felt heavy and dangerous. He reached his guest room. The wooden door was heavy and dark. He remembered closing it tightly before he went to the tower. Now, the door was open just a little bit. A small crack of yellow light came from the hallway. Alistair pushed the door open slowly. He stepped inside and waited. His eyes moved across the dark room. The room was very cold. The fire in the fireplace was dead, and only grey ash remained. Only the dim light from the snowy window showed the furniture. Alistair walked to the small table and lit a candle. The flame jumped and grew, casting long shadows on the stone walls. He looked at his bed. There was something new on his pillow. It was a dagger. The blade was long and made of bright, cold steel. It was stuck deep into the center of the white feather pillow. The handle was made of dark wood with a small silver bird on the end. Alistair did not touch the weapon yet. He looked at the base of the blade. There was a small piece of white paper held by the sharp metal. He pulled the paper away very carefully. The handwriting was strange. The letters were tall and sharp. They looked like they were written with a shaking hand or by someone trying to hide their style. The note had 5 simple words. Leave now or stay forever. Alistair felt a chill that was not from the winter wind. This was a clear message. The killer was not just hiding anymore. The killer was watching him. The killer wanted him to feel afraid. Stay forever meant death. It meant he would never leave the Iron Gate. He would become another ghost in the stone walls. He looked at the silver bird on the handle of the dagger. He remembered seeing a similar bird on a shield in the Great Hall. It was the mark of the castle's guards. Did the dagger belong to Captain Marek? Or did someone steal it from the weapon room to make the captain look guilty? Alistair walked to the door and locked it with the heavy iron bolt. He was safe for a moment, but he knew he could not stay in this room forever. He needed to find the truth before the killer found him again. He sat in the hard wooden chair and watched the door. He did not sleep. The night was very long, and the secrets of the castle were everywhere. He was the hunter, but now, he was also the prey. Sir Alistair did not sleep during the night. He sat in his chair and watched the door until the sun came up. The light was grey and weak, but it was better than the dark. He took the long dagger from his pillow and wrapped it in a piece of brown cloth. He needed to find the person who owned this weapon. He walked through the cold hallways to the armory. The armory was a large room near the main gate. The air inside was heavy with the smell of metal, oil, and old leather. Long swords, heavy axes, and sharp spears hung on the stone walls. Captain Marek was there. He was alone. He was rubbing a long sword with a piece of oily cloth. The metal of the sword was bright and reflected the light of the torches. "Good morning, Captain," Alistair said. Marek did not look up. He continued to rub the sword. "It is not a good morning, Sir Alistair. A lord is dead and a storm is outside. Why are you here so early?" "I found something in my room last night," Alistair said. He walked to a wooden table and put the wrapped object down. He opened the cloth. The dagger with the silver bird handle lay on the wood. Marek stopped moving. He looked at the dagger for a long time. His face was hard and like stone. "Where did you get that?" "It was in my pillow," Alistair replied. Someone wants me to leave the iron gate. They used a dagger with the mark of your guards. Is this your knife? Marek. The captain dropped his oily cloth. He reached out to pick up the dagger. As he moved his hand, Alistair saw something. On the back of Marek's large, hairy hand, there was a fresh, deep scratch. The skin was red and angry. A small amount of dry blood sat on the edges of the wound. It looked like a scratch from a sharp piece of stone or a broken window frame. This is a guard's dagger, Marek said. His voice was a low growl. We have many of them in the armory. Anyone can walk in here and take one. The door is never locked during the day. That is a very deep scratch on your hand, Captain, Alistair said. He pointed to the wound. How did you get it? Did you perhaps catch your hand on a broken window in the high tower? Marek pulled his hand back quickly. He gripped the handle of his sword. I am a soldier, Sir Alistair. My hands are full of scars. I got this one yesterday while I was fixing a broken saddle in the stables. The leather tool slipped and cut me. Do not tell me how to do my job, and do not call me a killer. Marek stepped closer to Alistair. He was much taller and much stronger than the Investigator. The room felt very small. I loved Lord Cedric. I protected him for 20 years. You are a stranger from the King's City. You know nothing about us. Alistair did not move back. He looked into Marek's angry eyes. I know that a man is dead and the golden seal is gone. I know that someone tried to scare me with this blade. If you are innocent, help me find the truth. If you are not, the King's law will find you. Marek laughed, but it was a cold, dry sound. He turned back to his sword. Go find your ghosts, Alistair, but stay away from my guards. Alistair took the dagger and walked out. He felt the weight of the metal in his hand. Marek was strong and angry. He had a scratch on his hand. He had the weapons. But was he the one who used the poison? Or was he just a man with a bad temper? Sir Alistair returned to Lord Cedric's bedroom. The room was still very cold. The broken door was covered with a heavy grey blanket to keep the wind out. The smell of bitter almonds was weaker now, but it was still there. Alistair stood in the center of the room and looked at the walls. He did not believe in magic. He believed in stone, wood, and metal. If a man left a locked room, there was a physical way out. He walked to the large bed. He looked at the floor under the bed. It was solid stone. He walked to the windows. The iron bars were thick and deep in the wall. He then turned his attention to the walls. In many medieval castles, the walls were covered with tapestries. These were large, heavy cloths with pictures of hunters, forests, and kings. They were beautiful, but they also kept the room warm by covering the cold stone. Alistair went to the largest tapestry. It was behind the Lord's desk. It showed a great white stag in a green forest. Alistair reached out and pulled the heavy cloth away from the wall. The fabric was dusty and made him cough. Behind the tapestry, the wall looked normal. It was made of large, square grey stones. He began to touch every stone. He used his knuckles to tap on the rock. Most of the stones made a solid, dull noise. But near the floor, one stone sounded different. It sounded hollow. Alistair knelt down. He looked at the edges of the stone. There was no dust in the cracks. This stone moved often. He pushed the left side of the stone. Nothing happened. He pushed the right side. He felt a small movement. He pushed harder with both hands. There was a low, grinding noise of stone rubbing against stone. Suddenly, a section of the wall, 3 stones wide and 5 stones high, swung backward. It was a small, secret door. Alistair looked into the opening. It was very dark inside. He went to the desk and took a small candle. He held the flame near the opening. He saw a very narrow tunnel. The floor of the tunnel was covered in a thick layer of grey dust, but the dust was disturbed. He saw clear footprints. They were the prints of a man's boots. The prints led away from the bedroom and into the darkness of the wall. "This is it," Alistair whispered. "This is how the killer entered. And this is how they left." He stepped into the tunnel. The air was very old and smelled like dry earth. The space was so narrow that his shoulders touched the cold stone on both sides. He had to walk sideways in some parts. He followed the footprints. The tunnel went down into the heart of the fortress. It was a silent, secret world inside the thick walls. Alistair felt a cold wind on his face. The tunnel was not completely closed. There was a small flow of air from somewhere. He kept walking, holding his candle high. He realized that this tunnel could lead anywhere. To the kitchen, the library, or even outside the castle walls. The iron gate was not a prison. It was a hive of secret paths. And the killer knew all of them. Sir Alistair moved deeper into the secret tunnel. The light from his candle was small and weak. It did not reach the end of the dark path. The walls were made of rough, cold stone. He had to keep his head low because the ceiling was very close. He saw many spiderwebs hanging from the rocks. They looked like thin, grey ghosts in the jumping light. The air was very dry. It smelled like old earth and ancient dust. Alistair followed the footprints on the floor. The prints were very clear in the thick dust. He could see the shape of the boot and the heel. These were not the boots of a common servant. They were the boots of someone with money. After a few minutes, the narrow path opened into a small, square room. It was built into the thickest part of the castle wall. There was no window and no chair. There was only a small wooden shelf made of dark pine. On the shelf, Alistair saw a rolled piece of parchment. It was tied with a thin piece of black wool. Alistair picked up the parchment. It was very old. The edges were yellow and dry. He untied the black wool and opened the paper carefully on the shelf. It was a map of the Iron Gate fortress. But this was not a map of the halls or the towers. This was a map of the hidden world. The map showed many lines. One line started in Lord Cedric's bedroom. It went down into the kitchen. Another line went to the library. A third line went up to the high tower. Alistair felt a chill. The person who killed the Lord used these paths. They could move through the castle like a ghost. No guard could see them. No locked door could stop them. He looked at the bottom of the map. There was a long line that went under the castle walls. It led into the dark forest outside. At the end of the line, there was a small drawing of a flower and a single word. "The rose. The rose," Alistair said softly. His voice made a low echo in the small room. He did not know a place called the Rose. Was it a house? Or was it a secret meeting place for traitors? He looked at the footprints on the floor again. They did not stop at the shelf. They went further into the darkness. They went toward the path that led outside the castle. Suddenly, a sound came from the tunnel ahead. It was the sound of a heavy stone sliding against the floor. Alistair quickly blew out his candle. The darkness was thick and heavy. He stood perfectly still. He listened. He heard the sound of soft, fast breathing. Someone was very close to him. The person did not speak. Alistair did not move. He held his breath. Then, he heard the sound of leather boots hitting the stone. The person was running away. The sound of the footsteps grew quieter and quieter until there was only silence again. Alistair lit his candle. The small room was empty. He looked at the map in his hand. He had the secret of the castle. But the killer was still moving in the shadows. He needed to find where the tunnel ended. He needed to find the truth about the rose. Sir Alistair held the old map tightly in his hand. The candle flame moved in the cold air. He followed the line on the parchment. The line went deep under the main hall. It ended at a heavy wooden door. Alistair walked for many minutes through the narrow stone path. The air became damp and smelled like wet earth and old wood. He reached the end of the tunnel. There was a large wooden board in front of him. He pushed the board. It did not move at first. He pushed again with his shoulder. The board moved slowly. Alistair stepped through the opening. He was in the wine cellar. The room was very large and very cold. The walls were lined with hundreds of wooden shelves. Thousands of glass bottles sat on the shelves. Some were covered in thick grey dust. Others were clean and shiny. The room smelled like sour grapes and heavy oak. Large wooden barrels sat in the corners of the room. Alistair looked at the map again. He looked for the word, the rose. He walked past rows of red wine and white wine. He looked at the labels on the bottles. Most of the labels had the names of faraway lands or the marks of local farmers. Then, he saw a small shelf in the darkest corner of the cellar. There was only one bottle on this shelf. It was a beautiful bottle made of dark green glass. The label was not paper. It was a piece of dry leather. On the leather, someone had burned the image of a single rose. Alistair picked up the bottle. It was almost empty. Only a small amount of clear liquid remained at the bottom. He pulled the cork out of the bottle. Immediately, the air around him changed. A very strong smell filled his nose. It was the scent of bitter almonds. It was the exact same smell from Lord Cedric's bedroom. It was the smell of the fast poison. "This is the source," Alistair whispered. He held the bottle up to the light of his candle. The liquid looked like water, but he knew it was death. He looked at the leather label again. Under the rose, there were small letters written in black ink. It was a date from 1 week ago. Next to the date, there was a small signature. It was a single letter, E. Alistair thought of the people in the castle. Ilara. Her name started with E. She was the Lord's daughter. She was at the dinner. She was hiding a letter in her sleeve. Did she put the poison in her father's wine? Suddenly, Alistair heard a heavy footstep on the stone stairs of the cellar. The sound was loud in the quiet room. Someone was coming down from the main hall. He did not have time to go back into the secret tunnel. He quickly hid the green bottle under his cloak and moved into the shadows behind a large wooden barrel. A person walked into the cellar. The person carried a bright torch. The orange light filled the room. Alistair stayed very still. He watched through a small gap between two barrels. He saw a pair of heavy leather boots. Then he saw a long sword. It was Captain Marek. The captain walked straight to the small shelf where the green bottle was kept. He looked at the empty shelf. His face turned very angry. He hit the stone wall with his fist. "Gone!" Marek shouted. His voice echoed off the wine bottles. Marek looked around the room. His eyes moved toward the dark corners. Alistair gripped the handle of his own dagger. He did not breathe. He waited for the captain to move. Sir Alistair stayed in the shadows behind the large wine barrels. He did not move. He did not even blink. Captain Marek stood in the center of the cellar for a long time. The orange light from his torch danced on the stone walls. Marek looked angry and confused. He looked at the empty shelf again. Then, he turned around and walked back up the stone stairs. The heavy wooden door at the top closed with a solid, deep noise. Alistair waited for a full minute. Then, he stepped out of the darkness. He still had the green bottle with the rose label under his cloak. He knew he could not go back through the main hall. He went back into the secret tunnel and followed the dusty path. He came out behind the tapestry in the Lord's bedroom. He checked the hallway. It was empty. He walked down to the castle courtyard. The snow was still falling, but the wind was quieter now. He walked across the slippery mud to a small stone building near the back wall. Black smoke came from a hole in the roof. This was the blacksmith's shop. Inside, the air was very hot. A large fire burned in a stone furnace. The light was bright and red. Silas, the blacksmith, stood by an anvil. He was a very old man with skin like dark leather and muscles like thick ropes. He wore a heavy apron made of black cowhide. He held a piece of red, glowing metal with long iron tongs. He hit the metal with a heavy hammer. Each blow made a sharp, singing sound that echoed in the small room. "Master Silas," Alistair said. He had to speak loudly over the sound of the hammer. Silas stopped his work. He put the red metal back into the fire. He wiped his forehead with a dirty cloth. His face was covered in black soot. He looked at Alistair's fine clothes and then at the king's ring on Alistair's finger. "A royal investigator," Silas said. His voice was deep and slow. "You are here about the Lord. It is a sad day. Cedric was a fair man." "I'm looking for answers, Silas," Alistair said. "Did the Lord come to see you recently? Did he ask you for anything strange?" Silas sat down on a wooden stool. He looked at the dancing flames of the furnace. "Yes. 1 week ago, Lord Cedric came here late at night. He did not bring his guards. He looked very worried. He asked me to make a special object." "What was it?" Alistair asked. He stepped closer to the heat of the fire. "A key," Silas replied. "But not a normal key. He wanted a master key. He told me it must open every door in the iron gate, every bedroom, every gate, and every secret box. He said the metal must be unbreakable." Alistair felt a pulse of excitement. "Did you make it for him?" "I did," Silas said. "I worked for 3 days. It was a beautiful key made of dark steel. I gave it to him 4 days ago. He was very happy. He put it on a silver chain around his neck and left." Alistair thought about the body of Lord Cedric. He remembered the Lord's neck. There was no silver chain. There was no master key. "Is there another key like it?" Alistair asked. "No." Silas shook his head. "I am a master blacksmith. I never make the same key twice. That key was the only one in the world." Alistair thanked the old man and walked back out into the cold air. If Lord Cedric had a master key that opened every door, then the person who killed him now had that key. The killer did not need to break locks. They could walk into any room they wanted. Alistair realized he was no longer safe, even behind a locked door. The wind at the top of the high tower was even stronger than before. Sir Alistair climbed the narrow stairs again. He wanted to look at the broken window one more time. The air was so cold it felt like needles on his skin. He stood in the small, round room and looked at the grey sky. The sun was hidden behind thick, heavy clouds. Suddenly, he saw a dark shape in the air. It was moving very fast toward the tower. At first, Alistair thought it was a large piece of black cloth blown by the wind, but the shape grew bigger and more stable. It was a bird. It was a large falcon with brown feathers and very sharp yellow eyes. The falcon flew through the broken window and landed on a wooden beam near the ceiling. It moved its head from side to side and looked at Alistair. The bird was not afraid. It sat very still. Alistair noticed a small leather tube tied to the bird's leg. This was a messenger bird. Alistair reached into his pocket and found a small piece of dried meat from his breakfast. He held his hand out very slowly. The falcon looked at the meat. It hopped down from the beam and landed on Alistair's leather glove. The bird's claws were sharp and strong. It ate the meat quickly. Alistair used his other hand to untie the leather tube. His fingers were stiff from the cold. But he was careful. He did not want to hurt the bird. Once the tube was free, the falcon spread its wings. It made a loud, sharp cry and flew back out into the snow. Inside the tube, there was a small roll of parchment. The paper was very thin and expensive. On the outside of the roll, there was only one word: Ilara. Alistair unrolled the paper. He expected to read a letter, but the message was very strange. There were no normal words. Instead, there were rows of numbers and small symbols. There were drawings of stars, moons, and crosses. It was a secret code. A message for the lady. Alistair whispered. He looked at the code. He could not understand it yet. He looked at the bottom of the page. There was no name, but there was a small drawing of a rose. It was the same rose from the green bottle in the wine cellar. Alistair felt a heavy weight in his chest. Lady Ilara was receiving secret messages from the person who owned the poison. Was she working with an enemy? Was she the person who killed her own father to take the Iron Gate? He heard the sound of footsteps on the stairs below. They were fast and light. Alistair quickly hid the parchment inside his tunic. He stepped away from the window and waited. Lady Ilara appeared in the doorway. She was wearing a heavy blue cloak with white fur. She was breathing hard, and her face was red from the climb. She looked around the room quickly. Her eyes moved to the wooden beam where the falcon sat just a moment ago. "Sir Alistair," she said. Her voice was surprised. "What are you doing up here again? It is far too cold for a walk." "I like the view, my lady," Alistair said. He watched her face closely. "I was watching a bird. A falcon. It just flew away." Ilara's eyes grew wide for a second. Then she looked at the floor. "The birds are hungry in the winter," she said softly. "I must go back down. The servants are preparing the afternoon meal." She turned and left quickly. Alistair waited until he could no longer hear her footsteps. He had the message, but he needed to find the key to the code. Sir Alistair left the high tower quickly. The secret message from the falcon was hidden inside his tunic. He felt the thin paper against his skin. It felt heavy, like a piece of lead. He needed to find a quiet place to study the code. But first, he had to speak with Silas the blacksmith again. The story about the master key was the most important clue he had. If that key opened every door, it was the most dangerous object in the Iron Gate. He walked across the courtyard. The snow was very deep now. It reached his knees in some places. The air was silent. Usually, the blacksmith's shop was the loudest place in the castle. The heavy hammer usually made a rhythmic sound against the anvil from morning until night. But today, the shop was quiet. No smoke came from the hole in the roof. Alistair reached the wooden door of the forge. He pushed it open. The room was dark and much cooler than before. The large fire in the furnace was now only a pile of grey and orange embers. The heat was fading. "Silas!" Alistair called out. His voice was steady, but he moved his hand to the handle of his sword. There was no answer. Alistair walked further into the room. He saw a shadow on the floor near the big stone furnace. He moved closer and held up a small candle. Silas lay on the ground. His heavy leather apron was twisted around his body. The old man was not moving. Alistair knelt down and put his hand on the blacksmith's chest. Silas was still breathing, but his breath was shallow and fast. There was a large, dark bruise on the side of his head. Someone had hit him with a very heavy object. Alistair looked around the floor. He saw a heavy iron bar lying near Silas's head. It was covered in a small amount of blood. This was the weapon. The killer was strong and fast. Alistair searched the blacksmith's pockets. He looked under the workbench and inside the tool chests. He was looking for the dark steel master key that Silas mentioned. He looked for the silver chain that belonged to Lord Cedric. He found nothing. The master key was gone. The killer had it now. "Wake up, Silas," Alistair whispered. He rubbed the old man's cold hands. Silas moved his head a little bit. His eyes opened, but they were blurry and confused. He looked at Alistair but did not seem to recognize him. He tried to speak, but only a soft, wet sound came from his throat. He raised a shaking hand and pointed toward the back door of the shop. This door led to the stables and the outer wall. Alistair looked at the floor near the back door. The ground was covered in black soot from the fire. In the soot, there was a single, clear footprint. It was a small footprint, much smaller than the boots of Captain Marek. It was the print of a slender boot, the kind worn by a lady or a very thin man. Alistair felt a cold wave of realization. The killer was not just a ghost in the walls. The killer was active and dangerous. They were hurting anyone who knew too much. Silas was lucky to be alive. But for how long? Alistair stood up. He needed to get help for Silas, but he also needed to watch the back door. The person with the master key could now enter any room in the iron gate, including Alistair's own room while he slept. Sir Alistair quickly called for Martha the cook. He told her to stay with Silas and wash the wound on his head. Martha was afraid, but she was a brave woman. She brought warm water and clean cloths. Alistair knew Silas was in good hands. He had other work to do. He needed to find the person with the small boots and the master key. Night fell over the Iron Gate fortress once again. The storm outside was a monster that never slept. The wind screamed around the towers, but inside the castle, the air was heavy and still. Alistair did not go to his room. He did not want to be a target in his bed. Instead, he found a dark corner in the main hallway. He stood behind a very large stone pillar near the entrance to the library. The hallway was long and narrow. A few torches burned on the walls, but they were low. The orange light was weak. It created many long, dancing shadows. Alistair pulled his dark cloak around him. He became a part of the shadows. He waited. He did not move his arms or legs. He even tried to make his breathing very quiet. Hours passed. The castle grew colder. Alistair's feet felt numb, but he stayed focused. He watched the door of the library. He knew the secret code was the next piece of the puzzle. If Lady Alara or the killer wanted to read the message, they would need the books in that room. Finally, he heard something. It was not a loud noise. It was a very soft movement of leather boots on the stone floor. The person was walking very slowly and very carefully. Alistair held his breath. He pressed his back against the cold stone of the pillar. A figure appeared at the end of the hallway. The person wore a long, black cloak with a deep hood. The hood covered their face completely. In the dim light, the figure looked like a ghost. The person stopped in front of the library door. They reached out a hand from under the cloak. The hand was small and pale. Alistair watched the person's hand. They held a dark metal object. It was the master key. The person put the key into the heavy iron lock. The metal parts of the lock moved with a sharp, dry sound. The person did not have a candle. They were moving in the dark as if they knew every inch of the castle. The heavy wooden door of the library opened slowly. It made a low, moaning sound against the floor. The figure stepped inside and closed the door. Alistair heard the sound of the lock turning again. The person had locked themselves inside. Alistair waited for a moment. His heart was beating fast against his ribs. He stepped out from behind the pillar. He moved like a cat across the stone floor. He reached the library door and put his ear against the wood. Inside, he heard the sound of paper moving. He heard a chair being pulled across the floor. Then, he heard a match strike. A small line of yellow light appeared under the door. The person was lighting a candle. They were looking for something in the books. Alistair looked at the lock. He did not have a key. He could not enter without making a lot of noise. He needed to wait for the person to come out. He moved back into the shadows and prepared to follow the light. Sir Alistair stayed in the shadows of the library hallway for a long time. The light under the door stayed bright. The person inside was busy. Alistair decided to move. He needed to find where the poison came from. He remembered the smell of bitter almonds. He remembered the mud on Brother Thomas's boots. He knew he had to visit the garden. He walked through the quiet castle and went out into the cold night. The snow was still falling, but it was light. He walked to the back of the fortress. There, behind a high stone wall, was the monk's garden. Usually, a garden is a place of beauty and life. But in the middle of winter, it looked like a graveyard. The bushes were black and bare. The ground was a mix of white snow and dark, frozen mud. Alistair carried a small lantern. He held it low so the guards on the walls would not see him. The light hit the ground. He saw the rows of dead plants. Brother Thomas grew many things here. There were labels made of small pieces of wood. Alistair read the names. Lavender, mint, sage. These were for tea and medicine. He walked to the very end of the garden. This area was close to the kitchen wall. The stones of the wall were warm from the kitchen fires. Because of this warmth, the snow here was melting. This created the dark, wet mud that Alistair saw on the monk's boots. In this warm corner, a few plants were still green. Alistair knelt down. He saw a plant with long, thin leaves and small, white flowers. The flowers looked like tiny bells. He leaned closer and took a careful breath. The scent hit him immediately. It was the smell of bitter almonds. It was the devil's breath. So, it grows here. Alistair whispered. He looked at the base of the plant. The earth was disturbed. Someone had recently dug into the mud to take the seeds or the roots. There were small holes in the ground. Nearby, he saw a small wooden tool. It was a hand shovel used for gardening. It was covered in the same dark mud. Alistair looked at the white flowers. They looked innocent, but he knew they were deadly. Brother Thomas was the only person who worked in this garden. He was the master of these plants. Did the monk grow this poison to kill the Lord? Or did someone else steal the plants from him? Suddenly, the wind changed. Alistair heard a soft rustle of cloth. It was not the wind in the trees. It was the sound of a long robe moving over the snow. He quickly blew out the flame in his lantern. The garden became pitch black. He looked toward the garden gate. A shadow was standing there. The figure was short and wore a heavy brown robe. It was Brother Thomas. The monk stood still, looking at the patch of white flowers. He held a small basket in his hands. He did not see Alistair in the darkness. The monk sighed. It was a sound of great sadness. He knelt in the mud and began to pray in a low, shaking voice. He reached out and touched the devil's breath plant. "I am sorry." The monk whispered, "I am so sorry." Alistair watched from the shadows. Was the monk sorry because he killed a man? Or was he sorry because his garden was used for a crime? Alistair did not move. He waited for the monk to finish his prayer. Sir Alistair stayed very still in the dark garden. He watched Brother Thomas. The monk was still kneeling in the cold mud. His brown robe was wet and dirty. The monk's voice was very low, like a soft wind in the trees. He seemed to be talking to the plants, or perhaps to a ghost. Alistair felt a little bit of pity for the small man. The monk looked very old and very tired in the darkness. After a few minutes, Brother Thomas stood up. He picked up his small basket. He did not look around. He walked slowly toward the garden gate. Then, the monk was gone. Alistair was alone again in the shadow of the great stone wall. Alistair decided to leave the garden. He needed to get back inside the castle and think about the devil's breath flowers. He stood up from his hiding place behind a thick bush. His legs were stiff and cold. He brushed some snow from his cloak. He took one last look at the white flowers near the kitchen wall. Suddenly, he heard a new sound. It was not the wind. It was a loud, scraping noise from high above. It sounded like heavy stone rubbing against other stones. Alistair looked up quickly. High on the castle wall, a dark shape was moving. A large, square stone was falling from the battlements. It moved through the air very fast. It looked like a giant black bird in the night sky. Alistair did not have time to think. He threw his body to the right. He landed hard in the cold, wet mud. A second later, the massive stone hit the ground. The impact was incredibly powerful. The earth shook under Alistair's chest. A cloud of snow and dark dirt flew into the air. If Alistair stayed in his spot for one more second, the stone would have crushed him. Alistair lay in the mud for a moment. His heart was beating like a drum in his ears. He looked at the stone. It was a very large piece of the castle wall. It was too heavy for the wind to move. It was too heavy to fall by accident. Someone had pushed it. He looked up at the top of the wall again. The battlements were 50 feet above him. He saw a flash of movement. A shadow moved away from the edge of the wall very quickly. It was too dark to see a face or a cloak. The person was gone in an instant. "Someone is watching me," Alistair whispered. His voice was shaking. He stood up slowly. His clothes were covered in mud and melted snow. His shoulder hurt from the fall. But he was alive. He looked at the giant stone again. It lay deep in the ground, right where he was standing just a moment before. This was not a warning like the dagger on his pillow. This was an attempt to kill him. The killer was no longer waiting for him to leave. The killer wanted him dead right now. Alistair realized that the iron gate was no longer a mystery to solve. It was a trap, and the teeth of the trap were closing on him. He needed to be very careful with every step he took. Sir Alistair stood in the dark garden for a long time. His heart was still beating very fast. He looked at the giant stone in the mud. He looked at the empty space high above on the castle wall. He was lucky to be alive. He was wet, cold, and covered in dark dirt. But his mind was sharp. He needed to see the place where that stone came from. He walked back into the castle. He found the stone stairs that led to the top of the outer wall. These stairs were outside and very slippery because of the ice. He climbed slowly. He held the cold iron rail with his gloved hand. The wind was very strong at this height. It made a loud, whistling noise as it passed through the gaps in the stone. He reached the top of the wall. This was the walkway where the guards usually stood. But tonight, the walkway was empty. The guards were likely near the main gate or inside the warm guard room. Alistair walked to the spot directly above the garden. The snow on the walkway was disturbed. He saw marks where a heavy object had been moved. There were deep grooves in the thin layer of ice. The stone was definitely pushed by a person. Alistair knelt down. He looked at the edge of the wall. The stone here was rough and jagged. He saw something small and bright. It was caught on a sharp piece of the grey rock. He reached out and pulled it free. It was a piece of cloth. It was a very beautiful shade of deep blue. Alistair held it up to the dim light of the moon. The fabric was not rough wool or heavy leather. It was silk. It was very soft and very expensive. In the Iron Gate Fortress, only one person wore silk of this quality. Lady Alara. Alistair whispered to himself. He remembered the blue cloak she wore earlier in the day. It was the same color. Had the lady of the castle tried to kill him, He thought about her pale face and her nervous hands. She seemed sad, but perhaps she was also dangerous. Alistair looked at the cloth again. It was torn in a jagged shape. The person on the wall must have moved very quickly. They were in such a hurry to push the stone and run away that they did not notice their cloak was caught. He looked down at the walkway again. He saw a few more footprints. They were small and narrow. They were the same footprints he saw in the soot of the blacksmith's shop. The person with the blue silk was also the person who hit Silas the blacksmith. Alistair felt a cold anger. He was the king's investigator, and someone was treating him like an animal to be hunted. He folded the blue silk and put it safely inside his tunic, next to the secret message and the green bottle. He had enough clues now. The poison, the secret message, the master key, and now the torn cloth. All the paths led to the same person. He needed to find Lady Alara. He needed to ask her why her silk was on a wall where a stone fell. He began to walk back down the stairs. The castle felt like a giant trap, and he was walking right into the center of it. He did not care about the danger anymore. He wanted the truth. Sir Alistair walked to the private rooms of Lady Alara. He did not care about his appearance. His cloak was heavy with wet mud. His face was dirty from the fall in the garden. His shoulder was sore, but his heart was full of a cold fire. He reached her heavy wooden door and pushed it open without a sound. Lady Alara was sitting in a tall, wooden chair near the window. She was looking at a small fire in her fireplace. The orange light made her pale face look soft. She held a book in her lap, but she was not reading it. She looked up quickly when Alistair entered the room. Her eyes went wide when she saw his muddy clothes and his angry face. "Sir Alistair!" she cried. She stood up so fast that her book fell to the floor. "What happened to you? You look like you fell into a grave." "I almost did, my lady," Alistair said. His voice was cold and hard, like the stone of the castle. He walked to the center of the room. He reached into his tunic and pulled out the piece of blue silk. He held it up so the light of the fire hit the fabric. "I found this on the high wall. It was caught on a sharp stone. A very large stone fell from that same spot. It almost crushed me. This silk is the same color as your cloak." Lady Alara looked at the silk. She turned very pale, almost as white as the snow outside. She looked like she was going to faint. She looked down at her long blue dress and her cloak. There was a jagged hole at the bottom of the fine fabric. The piece in Alistair's hand was a perfect match. "It is mine," she whispered. Her voice was very small and full of fear. "Why were you on the wall in the middle of a storm?" Alistair asked. He stepped closer to her. "Why did you push that stone, Lady Alara? Do you want me dead like your father?" "I did not push the stone," Alara said. She gripped the back of her chair with her thin hands. "I was on the wall, yes. I went there to meet someone. A secret visitor. But I did not hurt anyone. I heard a noise behind me in the dark, and I was terrified. I ran away so fast that my dress caught on the jagged rock. I did not even look back." "Who was this visitor?" Alistair asked. The smell of the garden mud was strong in the warm room. "A messenger," she replied. She looked at the door to make sure no one was listening. She lowered her voice. "He brings me news from the south. My father had many secrets, Sir Alistair. Some of those secrets are dangerous for me, too. I had to meet the man where the guards do not walk." "Did you see the person who pushed the stone?" Alistair asked. "No," she said. She was shaking now. "I only heard the sound of the stone moving. I thought it was a ghost or a demon of the storm. I ran for my life. Please, you must believe me. I have no reason to kill the king's man. You are the only person who can find the truth." Alistair looked into her eyes. She looked very afraid, but was it fear of him or fear of the killer? He still had the secret message and the green poison bottle. He did not tell her about them yet. He wanted to see how many more lies she would tell. A messenger from the south. Alistair repeated. And what news did he bring, my lady? Ilara looked at the fire. News of a war. A war that my father tried to stop. And a war that someone in this castle wants to start very soon. Alistair knew he could not trust her fully, but her story explained the footprints and the silk. If she did not push the stone, then someone was following her in the dark. Someone was watching her every move. Sir Alistair left Lady Ilara's room and walked back into the cold night. The wind was a low moan in the trees outside the walls. He walked to the center of the large courtyard. In the middle of the open space stood a very old well. It was made of massive grey stones covered in green moss. A small, pointed wooden roof protected the top. This well was ancient and dry. No water had lived at the bottom for 100 years. Alistair stood at the edge of the well. He looked down into the black circle. He held his lantern over the side, but the light did not reach the bottom. The hole was too deep and too dark. He felt a strange feeling in his chest. A dry well was a perfect place to hide a secret. It was a place where people never looked because there was nothing but dust and stones. He walked to the stables and found a long, thick rope. He carried it back to the well and tied one end to a heavy iron ring on the stone wall. He pulled the rope with all his strength to make sure the knot was solid. He took his lantern in one hand and began to climb down. His heavy leather boots touched the cold, wet stones of the inner wall. He moved slowly and carefully. He did not want to fall into the darkness. The air inside the well was very still and very heavy. It smelled like wet earth and old, rotten wood. He reached the bottom and stood on the ground. The floor of the well was covered in a thick layer of yellow straw and dead brown leaves. The snow from the sky fell through the opening above and made the straw slippery. Alistair moved the light of his lantern across the floor. He saw many old things. He saw a broken leather bucket. He saw a rusted metal hook. He began to move the wet straw with his hands. He searched every corner of the small, round space. His fingers were cold, and the dirt was under his fingernails. Suddenly, he saw a flash of dark metal near a large rock. He reached into a pile of wet leaves and pulled out a heavy object. It was a key. It was made of dark, strong steel and had a complex shape. It felt very cold and very heavy in his hand. A long silver chain was attached to the top of the key. Alistair knew this object immediately. This was the master key that Silas the blacksmith had made. This was the key that Lord Cedric wore around his neck on the night he died. Alistair wiped the dirt and the mud from the metal. The key was perfect and was not broken. Why was it here? Did the killer throw it down the well to hide the evidence? Or did Lord Cedric drop it during a struggle? Alistair put the silver chain around his own neck and hid the key under his tunic. Now, he had the power to open every door and every box in the iron gate. He was now the master of the fortress. But he was also in great danger. If the killer saw him with the key, they would try to kill him to get it back. He began to climb the rope again. His arms were tired, but he moved with energy. He reached the top and stepped onto the snowy ground of the courtyard. He looked at the high windows of the castle. They were dark and silent. The fortress was sleeping, but a murderer was still awake. Alistair walked back toward the main hall, holding the key against his chest. Sir Alistair climbed out of the dry well. His hands were dirty and his breath was heavy. The master key felt cold against his chest. He needed to talk to Silas the blacksmith immediately. The old man was the only person who could confirm if this was the true key of Lord Cedric. He ran across the dark courtyard toward the blacksmith's shop. The snow was falling faster now. It covered the ground in a thick, white blanket. The castle was silent, but Alistair felt a great sense of hurry. He pushed open the heavy wooden door of the forge. The room was not empty. Martha the cook was sitting on a wooden stool near the bed. She held a damp cloth in her hands. She looked up at Alistair, and her face was full of tears. She did not speak. She only pointed at the bed where Silas lay. Alistair walked to the bedside. The old blacksmith was very still. His eyes were closed, and his face was a pale, grey colour. Alistair reached out and touched the man's neck. There was no pulse. The skin was already losing its warmth. "What happened, Martha?" Alistair asked softly. "I told you to watch him." "I only left for a few minutes." Martha sobbed. She wiped her eyes with her apron. "I went to the kitchen to get some warm soup for him. When I came back, he was like this. He did not move. He did not make a sound." Alistair looked at the blacksmith's body very closely. He moved the old man's head to the side. On the right side of the neck, near the ear, he saw a tiny red dot. It was a very small hole, no bigger than a piece of hair. He reached into his pocket and took out a small pair of metal tweezers. He carefully pulled at the red dot. A thin, silver needle came out of the skin. The tip of the needle was covered in a strange, yellow liquid. Alistair held the needle up to the light of the candle. "This is a poison needle," he said. "The killer came back to finish the job. Silas knew too much about the key, so he had to die." But the door was closed. Martha cried. "I did not see anyone." Alistair looked at the back door of the shop. It was slightly open. The wind was blowing a small amount of snow into the room. He realized the killer used the master key, or perhaps a secret path, to enter the room while Martha was in the kitchen. He felt a wave of sadness. Silas was an innocent man. He was just a worker who made a key for his lord. Now, 2 men were dead, and the killer was still walking free in the iron gate. Alistair looked at the needle again. The yellow liquid had a faint smell. It was not bitter almonds this time. It was a different scent, sharp and metallic. He put the needle into a small leather pouch. "Go back to the kitchen, Martha," Alistair ordered. "Lock the door and do not open it for anyone. Not even for the captain. Not even for the lady. Do you understand?" Martha nodded quickly and ran out of the room. Alistair stood alone with the dead blacksmith. The fire in the furnace was almost out. The room was growing cold. He knew the killer was getting desperate. They were killing anyone who could help the investigation. Alistair was now the only person left who knew the secrets of the key. Sir Alistair left the cold blacksmith's shop. He felt a deep sadness for Silas, but he had no time to cry. The killer was moving quickly, and Alistair had to move faster. He did not return to the main hall. Instead, he climbed a set of narrow wooden stairs to a small balcony. This balcony was high above the side gate of the castle. It was a dark, hidden spot where the guards rarely went. The moon was behind the clouds, but the snow on the ground was white and bright. Alistair looked down at the small iron gate. This gate was used for deliveries of wood and hay. It was supposed to be locked at night. Alistair waited in the shadows. He pulled his cloak tight to stay warm. After a few minutes, he saw a movement. A tall, wide man walked across the courtyard. He moved with a heavy step, but he was trying to be quiet. It was Captain Marek. He was not wearing his metal armor. He wore a dark leather jacket and carried his long sword. Marek reached the side gate. He did not use a key. He pushed the gate, and it opened with a soft, rusty groan. He stepped outside the castle walls and stood near a large oak tree. He looked left and then right. He was waiting for someone. A moment later, a second figure appeared from the dark forest. This person was shorter than Marek and wore a long, hooded cloak. The hood was pulled low over their face. The two men stood close together and spoke in very low voices. Alistair could not hear their words because of the distance and the wind. The hooded stranger reached into a bag and pulled out a small leather pouch. He handed it to Captain Marek. Marek opened the pouch and looked inside. The light of the moon came out from behind a cloud for a second. Alistair saw a bright, yellow flash of light from inside the pouch. Gold. Alistair whispered to himself. Marek closed the pouch and hid it inside his jacket. He nodded to the stranger. The stranger turned and disappeared back into the thick trees of the forest. Marek watched him for a moment. Then he walked back through the gate and closed it. He began to walk back toward the guardroom. Alistair felt a cold weight in his stomach. Was the captain of the guards a traitor? Silas said the master key was for the Lord. But Silas was now dead. The golden seal was missing. And now, the captain was taking gold from a stranger in the middle of the night. Alistair knew he could not stop Marek now. Marek was too strong and too dangerous to fight alone in the dark. He needed to know who the stranger was. He needed to know where that gold came from. He waited until Marek was inside the castle. Then, Alistair climbed down from the balcony. He did not go to his room. He went to the side gate. He pushed it. But it was now locked. Marek had locked it behind him. Alistair looked at the dark forest. The tracks of the stranger were already being covered by the falling snow. He had to follow the man now, or the trail would be lost forever. He climbed over the low part of the stone wall and dropped into the deep snow on the other side. He began to run into the woods. Sir Alistair entered the forest. The trees were tall and black against the white snow. He had to be very quiet. He followed the footprints of the hooded stranger. The footprints were still fresh. The stranger was walking fast, but the snow was very deep, and it slowed him down. Alistair stayed behind the large trees. He did not want the stranger to see him. The forest was very dark. The only light came from the moon between the clouds. The wind moved the branches, and they made a long, rubbing sound against each other. Alistair felt the cold air inside his lungs. After walking for 10 minutes, Alistair saw a small light. It was not a torch. It was a very small fire hidden behind a large rock. The fire was small so that the guards in the castle towers could not see it. Alistair moved closer. He crawled on his stomach through the cold, wet snow. He reached the rock and looked over the edge. The hooded stranger was there. He sat near the fire. He was warming his hands over the tiny orange flames. A brown horse stood near a tree. The horse was tied to a branch and was ready to travel. The stranger took off his heavy hood. He was a middle-aged man with a short, black beard and a thin scar across his nose. He looked tired and very worried. The man opened his heavy cloak to get closer to the heat. Under the cloak, he wore a grey tunic made of thick wool. Alistair saw a symbol on the chest of the tunic. It was a red hawk with its wings open. Alistair knew this symbol very well. It was the mark of the Duke of Ravenhill. The Duke lived in the lands to the south. The Duke and the King were not friends. They had fought many wars in the past 10 years. A messenger from the south. Alistair thought. The man took a small piece of dry bread from a bag. He ate it quickly. He looked at a second leather pouch in his bag. It was full of the same gold coins he gave to Captain Marek. The coins made a soft, metallic sound as he moved the bag. The messenger stood up. He walked to his horse and checked the leather bags on the animal's back. Alistair saw many rolls of parchment inside the bags. These were letters. Some were sealed with red wax. Alistair realized the danger was much bigger than he thought. This was not just a story about a stolen seal or a dead lord. It was a plan to betray the king. If the Duke of Ravenhill was paying the captain of the guards, the castle was not safe. The Iron Gate was the only thing stopping an army from the south. Without the castle, the king's land would fall. Suddenly, the horse moved its head. It made a loud, blowing noise through its nose. The horse stepped back and hit a dry branch. The branch broke with a sharp, snapping sound. The messenger stopped. He looked toward the rock where Alistair was hiding. He reached for a small, sharp knife at his belt. "Who is there?" the man asked. His voice was a harsh whisper. Alistair stayed perfectly still. He pressed his face into the cold snow. He did not move a muscle. He waited for the man to come closer. The mystery was now a matter of war. The messenger stepped toward the large rock, his boots crunching in the frozen snow. He held his knife low, his eyes scanning the darkness. Sir Alistair pressed his body into the cold earth, praying that his dark cloak would hide him. The smell of wood smoke and wet pine was thick in the air. The man was only 5 feet away now. "I know you're there," the messenger hissed. Marek said he'd keep the woods clear. "If you're one of his dogs, speak now, or I'll open your throat." Alistair realized the messenger thought he was a guard from the castle. He didn't move. He kept his face down, his hand gripping the hilt of his sword. Just as the man reached the edge of the rock, a heavy branch high above snapped under the weight of the snow. It fell with a loud action 20 feet away. The messenger jumped, spinning around toward the noise. "Damned woods," he muttered. He waited for a moment, his chest heaving. He seemed to decide it was just the winter wind. He walked back to his horse, sheathing his knife. Before he mounted the animal, the man pulled one last item from his inner pocket. It was a thick envelope sealed with black wax. He looked at it for a long moment, then tucked it into the horse's stall bag, the one marked with the red hawk symbol. "Tonight it ends," the man whispered to the horse. "The rose will bloom, and the iron gate will fall." He climbed onto the horse and kicked its sides. The animal moved quickly, its hooves muffled by the deep snow. Within seconds, the messenger was swallowed by the dark trees, heading south toward the lands of the Duke of Ravenhill. Alistair stood up slowly, shaking the snow from his clothes. He was shivering, but not just from the cold. "The rose will bloom," he repeated. It wasn't a place. It was a person. A code name for the traitor inside the fortress. He looked back toward the castle. The lights of the high tower looked like small, lonely stars. He knew he couldn't follow the messenger further. He would freeze to death in the wilderness. But he had seen enough. Captain Marek was taking gold from the king's enemies. The Duke of Ravenhill was behind the plot. The rose was the final piece of the puzzle. Alistair began the long walk back to the side gate. He used the master key he had found in the well to slip back inside the walls. The iron lock turned perfectly. Silas's work was flawless, even in death. He reached the main hall just as the first hint of blue light appeared in the eastern sky. He was exhausted, but he couldn't sleep. He went straight to the library. He needed to find out who the rose was before the sun was fully up. If the messenger was right, tonight was the night the castle would fall. Sir Alistair closed the heavy library door and turned the master key in the lock. The click was loud in the morning silence. He walked to the back of the room, where the tall windows let in the first grey light of dawn. He was shivering, his cloak still damp from the forest snow. He pulled the falcon's message from his tunic. The rows of stars, moons, and crosses looked back at him like a wall of stone. He sat at the desk where Brother Thomas usually worked. He needed a cipher, a way to turn these pictures into words. "Think, Alistair," he whispered. "The rose, the red hawk, everything is a symbol." He looked at the shelves. His eyes scanned the titles. The History of the Iron Gate, Lives of the Saints, The Stars of the North. He pulled down the Book of Stars, but the diagrams did not match the symbols on the parchment. He put it back and looked again. Near the bottom shelf, he saw a small, thin book with a faded leather cover. There was no title on the spine. He opened it carefully. The first page was a drawing of a single, beautiful flower. The Secret Language of Flowers. The title page read. Alistair turned the pages quickly. He found the section on roses. Under the drawing of a red rose, there were small symbols, crosses and moons. His heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just a book about gardening. It was a code book. He laid the falcon's message next to the book and began to work. It was slow, frustrating labor. Each symbol represented a letter or a phrase. Moon plus cross equals tonight. 3 stars equals the south gate. A falling leaf equals open. After an hour, the message was clear. His breath caught in his throat as he read the translation. The rose blooms tonight. At the second bell of midnight, the south gate must be opened. The red hawk will bring the fire. Kill the king's dog first. The king's dog, Alistair said, a grim smile touching his lips. That would be me. He looked closer at the book. On the very last page, there was a small pressed flower, a dried white rose. Next to it, a name was written in elegant, flowing script. It wasn't Ilara. It wasn't Marek. The name was Thomas. Alistair stared at the page. The quiet, praying monk. The man who cried over his plants in the mud. It made sense now. The devil's breath grew in his garden. He had the knowledge of poisons. He spent every night in the library, where the secret codes were hidden. He was the rose because he was the master of the garden. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the desk. Alistair looked up. Standing in the doorway of the library, holding a heavy iron candlestick, was Brother Thomas. The monk was no longer hunched over or shaking. He stood tall, and his eyes were as cold as the winter outside. You are a very good investigator, Sir Alistair, the monk said. His voice was no longer a whisper. It was sharp and commanding. But you have learned a secret that will be buried with you. Sir Alistair did not move from the desk. He kept his hands flat on the open codebook. The light of the rising sun was hitting the library's dust, making the air look thick and grey. Brother Thomas stood in the doorway, the heavy iron candlestick glinting in his hand. The monk's face, once full of prayer and kindness, was now a mask of cold determination. A monk and a traitor, Alistair said, his voice steady. I should have seen it sooner. The mud on your boots wasn't just from the herb garden. You were checking the secret paths. You were the shadow in the kitchen. You were the one who poisoned the Lord's wine with the devil's breath. Thomas took a step forward. He didn't look like a man of God anymore. Lord Cedric was a fool. The monk spat. He stayed loyal to a king who forgets his people. The Duke of Ravenhill understands power. He understands that the Iron Gate must fall so a new world can begin. I am not a traitor, Alistair. I am a builder of a better kingdom. By killing a good man in a locked room. Alistair stood up slowly. By striking an old blacksmith from behind. That is not building, Thomas. That is murder. Cedric found the letters, Thomas said, his grip tightening on the iron. He found the map I was drawing for the Duke's army. He was going to send for the king's executioners. I had no choice. I used the nectar of the garden to send him to his final rest. It was a mercy compared to what the Duke will do to this place tonight. Alistair looked at the monk's hands. And the golden seal. Where is it? Thomas smiled, a thin, cruel line. The seal is not just a piece of gold. It is the key to the internal mechanism of the South Gate. Without it, the heavy iron bars cannot be raised from the inside. Captain Marek has the seal now. At midnight, He will use it to let the Red Hawk's men into the courtyard. Alistair realized the full scale of the disaster. If the captain of the guards and the castle's monk were working together, the Iron Gate was already lost. "You think Marek is your friend?" Alistair asked, stepping around the desk. "He took the Duke's gold, yes. But men like Marek only care about themselves. Once the Duke is inside, he won't need a monk who knows too many secrets." "Silence!" Thomas shouted. He lunged forward with surprising speed. He swung the heavy candlestick at Alistair's head. Alistair ducked. The iron hit a stack of books, sending paper and dust flying into the air. Alistair grabbed the monk's arm. But Thomas was stronger than he looked. They struggled in the narrow aisle between the bookshelves. A heavy table overturned. Alistair managed to trip the monk, and they both fell to the stone floor. Thomas lost his grip on the candlestick. It rolled away under a shelf. Alistair pinned the monk down, pressing his forearm against Thomas's throat. "It's over, Thomas." Alistair hissed. "I have the master key. I have the message. I will stop Marek." "You are too late." Thomas gasped, a strange light in his eyes. The second bell of midnight is only hours away. The Red Hawk is already at the forest edge. You cannot stop an army. Sir Investigator. Alistair pulled a length of rope from his belt, the same rope he had used in the well. He tied the monk's hands tightly behind his back. He then used a piece of cloth to gag the man. "Stay here and pray, brother," Alistair said, standing up and breathing hard. "But do not pray for the Duke. Pray for your soul." Alistair grabbed the codebook and the message. He locked the library door from the outside with the master key. He had the traitor monk trapped. But the real battle was just beginning. He had to find Lady Alara. She was the only one left who could command the loyal guards, if there were any left. The sun sank behind the jagged peaks of the Iron Mountains, casting a long, blood-red shadow across the snow. Sir Alistair ran through the servants' passages, avoiding the main halls where Marek's men patrolled. His heart hammered against his ribs. The second bell of midnight was only hours away, and the air felt heavy with the scent of coming war. He burst into Lady Alara's chambers. She was standing by the window, her silhouette dark against the fading light. She turned, her hand flying to her throat in alarm. "Sir Alistair, you were supposed to be quiet, my lady." Alistair gasped, closing the heavy oak door and bolting it. "There is no time. The monk is the killer. Brother Thomas is the rose. I have him locked in the library." Ilara's eyes went wide. "Thomas. But he was my father's oldest friend. He held me when I was a child. He is a master of poisons and a spy for the Duke of Ravenhill," Alistair said, pulling the codebook from his tunic. "He killed your father because Lord Cedric found his maps. But that is not the worst of it. Captain Marek has taken the Duke's gold. He has the golden seal, and at midnight, he will open the south gate to let the Red Hawk's army into the Iron Gate." The color drained from Ilara's face. For a moment, she looked as though she might collapse. Then, something shifted in her expression. The grief vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp iron. She stood taller, her shoulders squaring. "The south gate," she whispered. "If that gate falls, the kingdom is open to the Duke. My father died to prevent this." "How many men can you trust?" Alistair asked. "Truly trust?" Ilara stepped to a small iron chest and opened it with a silver key. She pulled out a heavy belt and a small, elegant dagger. "Most of the guards follow Marek because they fear him, or because they think I am weak. But there are 12 men, the old guard. They served my father in the Great Wars. They are currently stationed at the North Watch. They will die for the name of Cedric. 12 against a fortress. Alistair muttered. It is a start. We do not need to fight the whole army. Ilara said, her voice steady. We only need to stop Marek from using the seal. The south gate mechanism is complex. It requires the seal to unlock the main gears. If we take it from him, the gate stays shut, and the Duke's army will be trapped in the blizzard outside. Alistair looked at her with newfound respect. Then we move now. Where is the captain? He will be in the guardhouse, preparing his men for the changing of the watch at 11 o'clock. She said. That is when he will move to the south gate. The plan of action. Alistair and Ilara stood over a small map of the courtyard. They moved quickly, their whispers sharp in the quiet room. The diversion. Ilara would send a servant to the guardhouse with a message, a royal summons, to draw Marek into the open courtyard. The strike. The 12 loyalists would secure the gear room of the south gate. The thief. Alistair, using the master key and his knowledge of the secret passages, would intercept Marek and recover the golden seal. If we fail, Alistair said, looking at the lady, the iron gate becomes a tomb tonight. Then we shall not fail. Ilara replied. She looked at the king's ring on Alistair's finger. For my father. For the king. Alistair nodded. He checked the weight of his sword and the master key. The game of shadows was over. Now, it was a race against the clock and the cold. Sir Alistair moved through the veins of the castle. The secret passages were narrower here, pressing against his shoulders like the weight of the fortress itself. He held a small, shielded lantern that cast only a thin sliver of light onto the damp stone. Above him, he could hear the heavy rhythm of marching boots. Marek's men, moving toward their stations for the midnight watch. He reached a small iron grate set into the wall. Through the slits, he looked down into the south gate gear room. It was a massive chamber filled with the smell of cold grease and ancient iron. Huge, jagged gears, some as tall as a man, stood silent and frozen. These gears controlled the heavy portcullis and the drawbridge. In the center of the room was a pedestal with a circular indentation. This was where the golden seal acted as the final key. Without it, the gears were locked by a series of internal pins that no amount of muscle could move. Alistair checked his pocket. He had the master key, the green bottle of poison, and the silver needle. He felt like a ghost, haunting the halls of a kingdom that was about to be sold. The first strike. Suddenly, the heavy oak door to the gear room swung open. 2 guards entered, carrying torches. They were followed by Captain Marek. The captain looked different tonight. He wore full-plate armor that gleamed a dull, sinister grey. Hanging from a heavy chain around his neck was a large, golden disc. The golden seal. Secure the perimeter. Marek barked. His voice echoed off the iron gears. The signal from the forest will come at the second bell. If any of the North Watch show their faces, kill them. Lady Ilara is to be confined to her room. If she resists, do what you must. Alistair's grip tightened on his sword. He watched as Marek walked to the central pedestal. The captain ran a gauntleted hand over the gold. He looked at it not with loyalty, but with greed. To him, this wasn't the heart of the Iron Gate. It was a bag of gold from the Duke. Sir! One of the guards called out, pointing toward the door. A messenger from the lady. She demands your presence in the courtyard. She says she has found the murderer. Marek laughed, a harsh, metallic sound. The girl is playing games. Tell her I am busy with the king's business. If she wants to talk, she can wait until the Red Hawk arrives to greet her. The shadows move. Alistair knew the diversion had failed. Marek was too smart to be lured away from the prize. He had to act now. before the second bell rang. He moved away from the grate and followed the passage to a small, hidden door that opened behind a massive wooden support beam in the gear room. He pressed the master key into the hidden lock. It turned with a silent, oily smooth motion. Silas had truly been a master of his craft. As the door swung open an inch, Alistair heard the sound of steel on steel from the hallway outside the gear room. Shouts erupted. The old guard had arrived. Lady Alara had not waited for the diversion to work. She had led her 12 loyalists directly into the fray. The sound of a desperate battle filled the air. Treachery! Marek screamed, drawing his long sword. The North Watch has turned. Kill them all. Marek's 2 guards ran toward the door to join the fight, leaving the captain alone by the pedestal. This was the moment. Alistair stepped out from behind the beam, his sword drawn and the lantern swinging at his hip. "It's over, Marek," Alistair said, his voice cutting through the din of the battle outside. "The rose is in a cage, and the king's law is here for the golden seal." Marek turned slowly, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. He didn't look afraid. He looked like a man who had been waiting for a reason to kill. "The king is far away, Investigator," Marek said, raising his sword. "And in this room, I am the only law that matters." The gear room felt smaller as the 2 men circled each other. The orange glow of the torches danced off the massive iron teeth of the machinery, casting long, jerking shadows. Outside, the sounds of the struggle continued. Shouts of, "For the Iron Gate," and the heavy pressure of shields clashing. But inside, there was only the sound of 2 men breathing and the rasp of boots on stone. "You're a light traveler, Alistair," Marek sneered, his voice echoing inside his great helm. "A scholar, a talker. You think a king's ring makes you a warrior. In this room, the only thing that matters is the weight of the blow." Marek lunged. His long sword whistled through the air with terrifying speed. Alistair stepped back, the tip of the blade missing his chest by a hair's breadth. He didn't have Marek's reach or his heavy plate armor, but he had something the captain lacked: agility and a desperate need to survive. "The duel in the gears," Alistair countered, his lighter blade striking Marek's shoulder. The steel sparked against the captain's armor, leaving only a shallow scratch. Marek laughed and swung again, a massive horizontal cut that forced Alistair to duck low. "Is that all?" Marek roared. Alistair realized he couldn't win a direct fight. He needed to use the room. He retreated toward the great gear, a massive wheel of iron that connected to the south gate's outer chain. He waited until Marek was mid-swing. Then he threw his heavy lantern at the captain's feet. The glass shattered. Oil spilled across the stone, and the small flame ignited, creating a momentary wall of fire between them. Marek stumbled back, shielded by his armor but blinded by the sudden flare. Alistair didn't go for the kill. He went for the golden seal. He lunged forward, his fingers clawing at the heavy chain around Marek's neck. The final struggle. Marek caught Alistair's wrist in a grip like an iron vice. He slammed the Investigator against the central pedestal. The air rushed out of Alistair's lungs, and spots danced before his eyes. "You want the gold," Marek hissed, his face inches from Alistair's. "I'll bury you with it." Marek raised his sword for a final, crushing blow. But as he did, he stepped into the oil-slicked stone. His heavy boot slipped. For a split second, the captain's balance was gone. Alistair didn't hesitate. He reached into his tunic and pulled out the poison needle he had taken from Silas's neck. With a cry of effort, he drove the silver point into the small gap in Marek's armor, the soft joint at the underside of the arm. Marek stiffened. The sword fell from his hand, hitting against the iron gears. His eyes went wide behind his visor. The yellow liquid, the same toxin that had silenced the blacksmith, worked with cruel efficiency, Silas sends his regards. Alistair whispered, his voice ragged. Marek collapsed to his knees, then fell forward with a heavy, metallic impact. He didn't move. The second bell. Alistair leaned against the pedestal, gasping for air. He reached down and unhooked the golden seal from the captain's neck. It was heavy, cold, and wet with oil. Suddenly, the silence of the room was shattered. The first bell of midnight. The sound vibrated through the stone floor and into Alistair's very bones. The second bell. Alistair looked at the door. He could hear the heavy movement of horses' hooves outside the south gate. The Red Hawk's army was here. They were waiting for the gate to rise. They were waiting for the signal. He looked at the pedestal. The golden seal fit perfectly into the circular slot. If he turned it, the gears would engage, and the gate would open, ending the kingdom. If he kept it, the gate would stay shut. But the Duke's men would soon realize something was wrong and start their assault on the walls. Alistair. He turned to see Lady Alara in the doorway. She was covered in soot, her blue dress torn, but she held a sword in her hand. Behind her stood only 5 of the old guard. They were blooded and exhausted. Marek's men are retreating to the walls, she shouted. But the Duke's army is at the bridge. They have a ram. Alistair held up the golden seal. The gate is locked. My lady. But we are 6 against 1,000. Then we make them pay for every inch of stone. Ilara said, her eyes burning with a fierce light. The movement of the battering ram echoed through the gear room like a giant's heartbeat. The massive south gate, built of oak and reinforced with iron, groaned under the pressure. Outside, the blizzard howled, mixing with the war cries of the Duke of Ravenhill's men. Sir Alistair stood at the top of the stairs, the golden seal clutched in his hand. Lady Alara stood beside him, her face set in a mask of grim determination. If that gate breaks, Alistair said, the gear room becomes a killing floor. We can't hold them here. Then we don't hold them here. Ilara replied. She pointed to a heavy iron lever near the ceiling, connected to a series of secondary chains. That lever releases the inner portcullis. It's a trap meant for invaders who break the first gate. It will drop a second wall of iron, trapping the Duke's vanguard in the tunnel between the gates. The final stand. Alistair looked at the remaining 5 members of the old guard. To the lever. Hold it until the first gate gives way. The men scrambled up the iron ladder. Below, the wood of the outer gate began to splinter. A massive iron head of a ram burst through the center, showering the floor with lethal shards of oak. Now! Alistair roared. The old guard threw their weight onto the lever. With a screech of protesting metal, the inner portcullis dropped. It fell with the force of a falling mountain, slamming into the stone floor just as the first of the Duke's knights surged through the broken outer gate. They were trapped. The Red Hawk's elite warriors were caught in a stone box, unable to move forward and blocked from retreating by their own ram. The King's justice. As the sun began to rise over the snowy peaks, the sound of a different horn echoed across the valley. It wasn't the harsh blare of the Red Hawk. It was the clear, melodic call of the Royal Vanguard. The King's army, led by the High Marshal, had arrived. Seeing the iron gate still standing and the Duke's forces trapped and disorganized in the snow, the invaders broke. The Red Hawk's banner fell into the slush, trampled by retreating horses. Alistair walked out into the courtyard. The air was cold and clean. The storm had passed. Captain Marek was found dead in the gear room, his treachery silenced by the very poison he had used on others. Brother Thomas was taken in chains to the King's city. He would spend the rest of his days in a cell, far from the gardens he had corrupted. The golden seal was returned to its velvet box, a symbol of a fortress that refused to break. The dawn of peace. Lady Alara stood on the battlements, watching the royal vanguard enter the courtyard. She turned to Alistair. Her blue dress was ruined, and her face was tired, but she smiled for the first time since the night of the dinner. "You found the truth, Sir Alistair," she said softly. "You saved my home. My father would have been proud to call you a friend." Alistair bowed. "I only followed the clues. My lady, it was your courage that held the gate." He reached into his tunic and pulled out the master key Silas had made. He handed it to her. "This belongs to the Lady of the Iron Gate. Use it to open doors of peace, not secrets." Alistair mounted his horse. He had a long ride back to the King's City. He had a story to tell, a story of a locked room, a traitorous monk, and a daughter who became a lioness. As he rode through the great stone archway, he looked back one last time. The Iron Gate stood tall against the mountains, its stones grey and eternal. The mystery was solved, the traitors were gone, and the king's law remained supreme. The gates of the Iron Gate fortress swung wide, not to an enemy, but to the shimmering silver plate and blue banners of the king's high marshal. Sir Alistair stood in the courtyard, his horse's reins in hand, watching the procession. 500 knights on white chargers rode in perfect formation, their lances held high. At their head was High Marshal Valerus, a man known as the Iron Lion of the capital. He was a legendary figure, a hero of a dozen wars, and a man whose loyalty to the king was said to be absolute. Lady Alara stood on the stairs of the great hall, her chin held high, though her eyes were shadowed with exhaustion. As Valerus dismounted, he removed his feathered helm, revealing a face of sharp angles and silver hair. He bowed deeply to Alara, then turned his gaze toward Alistair. "Sir Alistair," the marshal said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very stones of the courtyard. "The king heard word of unrest at the Iron Gate. It seems we arrived just in time to see the Red Hawk's tail feathers disappearing into the woods. You have done a great service to the crown." The service was Lady Alara's. Alistair replied, his voice neutral. He should have felt relief. The arrival of the High Marshal meant the castle was safe, the investigation was over, and he could return to his quiet life of books and logic. But something felt wrong. Alistair's mind, trained to look for patterns, noticed a small detail. The knights behind the marshal were supposed to be the king's first vanguard, the elite of the elite. Yet, as they dismounted, one of them brushed back his cloak. For a split second, Alistair saw a mark on the man's forearm. It wasn't the king's lion. It was a faint, red brand of a hawk. Alistair's heart went cold. He looked at the other knights. They were too quiet. They didn't move like weary soldiers who had marched through a blizzard. They moved like hunters who had just cornered their prey. He looked back at Valerus. The marshal was smiling at Alara, but his eyes remained cold, scanning the battlements, measuring the height of the walls. "You look troubled, Sir Investigator," Valerus said, stepping closer. "Is the weight of the golden seal too much for you? Perhaps it should be placed in my care for the journey back to the capital." Alistair felt the heavy weight of the seal in his tunic. He had intended to give it to Alara, but the marshal's request was a command. If he refused, he was a traitor. If he obeyed, he might be handing the key to the kingdom to the enemy. "The seal belongs to the Lord of the Iron Gate," Alistair said carefully. "And since Lord Cedric is dead, it belongs to Lady Alara until the king confirms her title." The marshal's smile didn't falter, but the air around them seemed to freeze. "Of course. We shall discuss the transition over dinner tonight. For now, my men will take over the watch. Your old guard looks like they need a long sleep." Alistair watched as the marshal's men took the spears from Ilara's loyalists. It wasn't a changing of the guard. It was a disarming. The Iron Gate had not been saved. It had been occupied. The great hall was filled with the sound of laughter and the clatter of silver plates. But the atmosphere was as tense as a drawn bowstring. High Marshal Valerus sat in Lord Cedric's chair, the seat of honor. Lady Alara sat to his right, her face a mask of polite ice. Alistair sat across from them, his eyes darting between the royal knights who stood against the walls. "To the king," Valerus toasted, raising a golden goblet. "And to the peace that follows the storm." The knights shouted their agreement, but Alistair noticed they didn't drink. They stayed alert, their hands never far from their sword hilts. Alistair looked at his own plate. The food was rich: venison, roasted root vegetables, and thick bread. But he found he couldn't eat. He kept thinking about the Red Hawk brand. If Valerus was a traitor, then the conspiracy went to the very heart of the king's court. It meant the Duke of Ravenhill wasn't just an enemy from the south. He was an ally of the man who commanded the king's armies. The Iron Gate was a trap, and they were the bait. "Tell me, Sir Alistair," Valerus said, leaning forward. "The monk, Thomas, where is he?" "In the dungeon, under heavy lock," Alistair replied. "A shame," the marshal sighed. "A man of the cloth turned to poison. I shall have my chaplain speak with him tonight. Perhaps we can learn more about his accomplices before we execute him." "I have already questioned him," Alistair said. "He spoke of a Grand Master in the capital, a man who moves the pieces on the board while the Duke simply provides the soldiers." Valerus paused, his goblet halfway to his lips. "A Grand Master, truly? And did this monk give you a name?" "He died before he could," Alistair lied. He watched Valerus's reaction. The marshal's eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second, a flicker of relief passing over his face. "Tragic," Valerus said. "But justice will find its way. Lady Alara, you look pale. Perhaps the excitement of the siege has been too much. My physician is excellent. He will prepare a tonic for you to help you sleep tonight." Ilara looked at Alistair. In the language of flowers they had studied in the library, a pale face and downcast eyes meant danger in the shadows. She understood. The tonic would be no different from the poison that killed her father. "I am fine, Marshal," Ilara said, her voice steady. "But I find I miss the quiet of the library. Sir Alistair was helping me catalogue my father's private collection. We have much work to do before we depart for the capital." "Work can wait," Valerus said, his voice losing its warmth. "Tonight, we celebrate. Tomorrow, we secure the Golden Seal. And then, we shall see who truly rules the Iron Gate." Alistair felt the master key in his pocket. He had to get to the dungeon. He had to talk to Thomas again before the marshal's chaplain silenced him forever. Alistair slipped away from the feast while the knights were distracted by a group of traveling minstrels the marshal had brought with him. He moved through the servants' passages, his boots making no sound on the stones. The castle felt different now, hostile, as if the walls themselves were watching him. He reached the entrance to the dungeons. Two of the marshal's knights stood at the door. They weren't the simple guards of the Iron Gate. They were professional killers. Alistair hid in the shadows of a stone archway. He knew he couldn't fight them. He needed a distraction. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a small glass vial. It was a harmless but potent smoke powder he had taken from Silas's workshop. He threw it against a torch on the wall. A cloud of thick, acrid black smoke filled the hallway. The guards coughed and drew their swords, shouting for light. In the confusion, Alistair used the master key to open a small side door used for removing waste. He slipped into the dark, damp air of the lower cells. He reached the cell where Brother Thomas was held. The monk was sitting on a pile of straw, his hands still tied. He looked up as Alistair approached. "You came back," Thomas whispered. "I thought you would be halfway to the capital by now, running from the ghost of your own failure." "The marshal is here, Thomas," Alistair said, kneeling by the bars. "But he didn't bring the king's justice. He brought the Red Hawk. Tell me the truth. Is Valerus the Grand Master?" Thomas laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Valerus. No. He is just a claw. The Grand Master is someone you would never suspect. Someone close to the king. Someone who knows that the golden seal isn't a key to a gate, but a key to the king's private vault in the capital. The vault? Alistair asked. What is in it? The original treaty of the Three Realms. Thomas said. The document that gives the king his right to rule. If it disappears, the kingdom falls into chaos. The Duke will move in, and the Grand Master will be the one to crown him. Suddenly, the heavy door at the top of the stairs creaked open. Alistair heard the heavy rhythm of armored boots. He's here, Thomas hissed. The chaplain. Run. Alistair. If they find you here, the truth dies with us. Alistair looked at the monk. He saw no more malice in the man, only the fear of someone who had realized he was a pawn in a game much bigger than he could handle. I can't leave you, Alistair said. Go, Thomas urged. Find the apprentice. Silas had an apprentice, a boy named Leo. He was hiding in the chimney of the forge. He saw who really poisoned the wine. It wasn't me, Alistair. I provided the flowers, but I didn't pour the glass. Alistair heard the guards entering the room. He turned and vanished into the darkness of the waste tunnel just as the cell door was kicked open. He had a new mission. He had to find the boy, and he had to find the truth before the iron gate became his tomb. The blacksmith's forge was a hollow shell of its former self. The great furnace, once the beating heart of the iron gate, was now nothing but a cold pile of grey ash and blackened stones. Sir Alistair stepped inside, the master key tight in his palm. The smell of cold iron and old smoke hung heavy in the air. He didn't light a torch. He relied on the faint, ghostly light of the moon filtering through the hole in the roof. Leo, Alistair whispered, his voice barely audible over the whistling wind. Leo, I am a friend of Silas. I know you are here. Silence was his only answer. Alistair moved toward the back of the forge, where the massive stone chimney climbed toward the ceiling. He remembered Brother Thomas's words. The boy was hiding in the flue. Alistair reached into the dark opening of the chimney. His hand came away covered in thick, greasy soot. I have the master key. Leo, Alistair said, holding the dark steel object up so it glinted in the moonlight. Silas made it for the Lord. He would want you to be safe. A soft rustle came from high above. A shower of soot fell onto the hearth, and then a pair of small, terrified eyes peered down from the darkness. A boy, no older than 12, slid down the inner wall of the chimney. He was covered from head to toe in black dust, making him look like a spirit of the forge. Is he gone? Leo gasped, his voice cracking with fear. The man with the silver eyes. Is he gone? Alistair knelt so he was at the boy's level. The marshal is here, but I am keeping watch. Silas told me you saw something the night the Lord died. You saw the person who poured the wine. Leo nodded, his breath coming in short, jagged gasps. It wasn't the monk. Everyone says it was Brother Thomas, but it wasn't. I was under the table, fixing a loose leg for Silas. I saw a pair of boots. Expensive boots, made of red leather with gold buckles. Alistair froze. Red leather was not worn by monks or guards. It was the fashion of the High Court in the capital. Did you see the face? Leo. No. The boy whispered, tears carving white paths through the soot on his cheeks. But I saw the hand that held the silver cup. It had a ring on the middle finger. A ring shaped like a coiled serpent with green emerald eyes. Alistair's blood ran cold. He had seen that ring before. It wasn't on the hand of the marshal, nor was it on the hand of the lady. It was the ring worn by Lord Julian, the king's own nephew and the man rumoured to be the next in line for the throne. The serpent. Alistair muttered. Thomas was right. This goes far beyond the Duke. Suddenly, the heavy door of the forge creaked open. Alistair shoved Leo back into the shadows of the chimney and drew his sword. A figure stood in the doorway, a tall, thin man in a physician's robe. "Looking for something, Sir Investigator?" the man asked. His voice was smooth and cold, like a snake sliding over stone. In the moonlight, Alistair saw the glint of a silver needle in the man's hand. The marshal's physician had arrived to clean up the last witness. Alistair stepped between the chimney and the man in the doorway. "You're a long way from the Great Hall, Doctor. I didn't know the marshal's staff took such an interest in cold iron." The physician, a man named Dr. Vane, stepped into the room. He didn't look like a healer. His eyes were hard and predatory, and he moved with the practiced grace of an assassin. "The marshal is a thorough man, Alistair. He doesn't like loose ends, and a boy who hides in chimneys is the loosest of ends." Vane raised the needle. It was longer than the one that had killed Silas, tipped with a dark, viscous fluid that shimmered with an unnatural light. "Step aside. My quarrel is not with the king's lapdog. Not yet, at least. The boy is under my protection," Alistair said, his sword tipped steady. "And the king's lapdog has a very sharp bite." Vane lunged. He was fast, faster than Marek had been. He didn't use a sword. He used a pair of long, surgical knives that he pulled from the sleeves of his robe. The steel hissed through the air, clashing against Alistair's blade. Vane fought with a terrifying, silent efficiency, aiming for the gaps in Alistair's defense, his eyes always flicking toward the chimney where Leo was hidden. Alistair parried a strike aimed at his throat, but Vane spun, his second knife slicing through Alistair's sleeve. The blade was cold, but it didn't draw blood, not yet. "You think you can save this kingdom with logic and keys?" Vane mocked, his voice a low hiss. "The Iron Gate is already sold. The treaty is as good as gone. You are fighting for a ghost." Alistair kicked a heavy iron bucket toward Vane's shins. The physician jumped back, but the momentary distraction was enough. Alistair grabbed a heavy iron poker from the hearth and swung it with all his might. It struck Vane's arm, causing a sharp crack. The physician snarled, dropping one of his knives. He looked at Alistair with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You have made a grave mistake, Investigator. The Grand Master does not forgive." Vane reached into his robe and threw a small glass sphere onto the floor. It shattered, releasing a cloud of thick, stinging white gas. Alistair coughed, his eyes burning. By the time the air cleared, the doorway was empty. Vane was gone, but his message was clear. The hunt had truly begun. Alistair turned back to the chimney. Leo was shaking so hard his teeth were chattering. "We have to move. Leo. Now. The castle is no longer a fortress. It's a slaughterhouse." Alistair led the boy through the back door and toward the stables. He knew he couldn't hide Leo in the castle anymore. He had to get him to Lady Alara. But first, he had to find a way to warn her about the serpent ring. The great hall was quiet now, the feast over and the fires burning low. Alistair reached Lady Alara's chambers through a secret passage that opened behind a large wardrobe. He pulled Leo into the room just as Alara was preparing to retire for the night. She jumped at the sight of them, her hand flying to the dagger at her waist. "Alistair!" And a chimney sweep. "This is Leo, Silas's apprentice," Alistair said, breathless. "He is the only witness to your father's murder." "Alara." It wasn't the monk. Thomas provided the poison, but the hand that poured the wine wore a serpent ring. Ilara's face went even paler than usual. She sat down heavily on the edge of her bed. "Lord Julian. He was here. But he was supposed to be at the border, inspecting the troops. He was here in secret," Alistair said. "And the Marshal is here to finish what Julian started. They want the Golden Seal because it opens the King's vault. They want the treaty." "Ilara." They want to delegitimize the king and put Julian on the throne. Ilara looked at Leo, then back at Alistair. Her eyes were full of a new, cold clarity. If they get the seal, the kingdom falls into civil war. My father knew this. That's why he had Silas make the master key, not just for the doors, but for a second, hidden lock on the seal's box. A second lock. Yes. Ilara said, standing up. The box where the seal is kept has a false bottom. The seal the marshal saw, the one you took from Marek, is a decoy. It looks real, it feels real, but it will not open the vault. The true golden seal is still hidden inside the castle walls, in a place only the master key can reach. Suddenly, a heavy pounding came from the door. Lady Ilara. It was the voice of High Marshal Valerus. Open the door. My physician tells me there has been an intruder in the forge. I must ensure your safety. Alistair looked at the wardrobe. Hide the boy. He whispered to Ilara. I will deal with the marshal. Ilara shoved Leo into the secret passage and closed the wardrobe just as the door to her chamber burst open. Valerus stepped inside, his hand on his sword, his eyes scanning the room. Behind him stood Dr. Vane, his arm in a makeshift sling, his face twisted in a silent snarl. Sir Alistair, Valerus said, his voice dripping with false concern. Still awake? I thought investigators required their rest. Or perhaps you were busy, obstructing justice. I was just telling the lady about the physician's unfortunate accident in the forge. Alistair said, his hand resting casually on the master key in his pocket. It seems the Iron Gate is a dangerous place for those who wander in the dark. The marshal stepped closer, his shadow falling over Alistair like a shroud. The dark is where the truth lives, Alistair, and I think it's time we brought the truth into the light. Give me the seal. Now. The air in the chamber was thick enough to choke a horse. High Marshal Valerus stood like a statue of iron, his hand extended, waiting for the prize. Beside him, Dr. Vane looked like a wounded vulture, his eyes darting toward the wardrobe where Leo was hidden. Alistair felt the cold weight of the metal disc in his tunic, the one he had stripped from Captain Marek's cooling corpse. The seal. Alistair. Valerus repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. Don't make me ask a third time. My patience is a shallow well, and you are leaning over the edge. Alistair looked at Ilara. She gave a microscopic nod. It was a gamble, a desperate play to buy the minutes they needed to escape and find the true heart of the fortress. Alistair reached into his tunic and slowly pulled out the golden disc. The firelight caught the intricate carvings of the Iron Gate crest. Here, Alistair said, tossing the heavy object. Valerus caught it. The marshal held it up, his eyes hungrily tracing the lines of the gold. Beautiful. He whispered. The key to a kingdom, held in the palm of a traitor's hand. You did well to surrender. Investigator. It shows you have a spark of intelligence beneath that stubborn skull. The king will hear of this. Valerus. Ilara said, her voice trembling with a mix of calculated fear and genuine rage. He will know that his marshal is a thief. The king will hear what I tell him. Valerus countered, slipping the seal into a velvet pouch at his belt. He will hear that Lord Cedric was murdered by a mad monk, and that his daughter was too distraught to rule. I am merely the steward of order. He turned to Vane. Keep a guard on this door. No one enters, and more importantly, no one leaves. I must prepare the royal message for the capital. As the heavy door slammed shut and the bolt turned from the outside, Alistair let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He turned to the wardrobe and pulled it open. Leo stumbled out, soot falling from his hair like black snow. He has it. Leo whimpered. He has the seal. No. Alistair said, his eyes flashing. He has a piece of painted lead and brass that Silas made to fool thieves. It will buy us an hour, maybe less, before his goldsmith realizes the weight is wrong. Then we have to move. Ilara said, stepping toward the back of the room. She pressed a hidden catch on the stone wall behind her bed. A narrow segment of the masonry slid inward, revealing a staircase that smelled of ancient dust and cold minerals. The true seal is kept in the founder's crypt, beneath the very roots of the mountain. Silas built the lock into the sarcophagus of the First Lord. Only the master key can turn the tumblers. Alistair gripped his sword. Lead the way, my lady. The sun will be up soon, and when the marshal finds out he's been tricked, the iron gate will truly become a cage. The founder's crypt was a place of silence, so absolute it felt heavy. The walls were carved directly into the bedrock of the mountain, damp with the tears of the earth. Alistair held the lantern high, its light flickering off the stone faces of dead lords and ladies who had held the iron gate against 1,000 winters. At the very end of the hall stood a massive tomb of black marble. It wasn't decorated with flowers or weeping angels, but with gears, chains, and iron bars. This was the tomb of Lord Alaric, the builder of the fortress. Silas spent months down here. Leo whispered, his voice echoing. He said the mountain has a heart made of clockwork. He said if you turn the right key, the mountain speaks. Ilara pointed to a small, unassuming hole in the side of the marble base. It looked like a natural crack in the stone, but Alistair saw the telltale marks of a master locksmith's tools. He pulled out the master key. It felt warm in his hand, as if it sensed it was close to its true purpose. Alistair inserted the key. It slid in with a perfect, oiled smoothness. He turned it. Deep within the stone, heavy weights shifted. The sound of grinding granite filled the crypt. The lid of the sarcophagus didn't open. Instead, a small pedestal rose from the floor in front of it. On the pedestal sat a small, iron-bound box. The false bottom. Alistair murmured, remembering Ilara's words. He opened the box. Inside was a second golden disc. At first glance, it looked identical to the one he had given Valerus. But when Alistair picked it up, the difference was immediate. It was heavier, much heavier, and when he touched the center, a small needle popped out, pricking his thumb. Alistair! Ilara cried. It's all right, he said, watching as a drop of his blood vanished into the gold. It's a bloodlock. Silas mentioned it once in his journals. It only opens for those whose intent is pure, or perhaps just those who are brave enough to bleed for it. The disc suddenly shifted. The gold plates slid over one another, revealing a hidden core of pulsating, glowing crystal. This was the true golden seal. It wasn't just a key. It was a masterpiece of ancient engineering and magic. We have it, Alistair said, closing the box. Now we just need to get it out of here and to the king. You won't be going to the king, Sir Investigator. The voice came from the shadows of the entrance. Alistair spun around, his sword clear of its scabbard in an instant. Standing there, silhouetted by the light of a single torch, was a man in a rich crimson cloak. On his hand, a ring shaped like a coiled serpent with emerald eyes glittered in the dark. Lord Julian had arrived. Lord Julian stepped into the circle of light. He was a handsome man, with the high cheekbones and arrogant eyes of the royal family. He looked more like a poet than a killer, but the blood on the hem of his cloak told a different story. My dear Ilara, Julian said, his voice smooth and cultured. You always were too clever for your own good. Your father should have married you off to a simpleton in the West. It would have saved us all a great deal of trouble. You killed him. Ilara spat, her hand trembling on her dagger. You sat at his table, drank his wine, and then murdered him in his sleep. Julian shrugged, a gesture of bored indifference. Cedric was a relic. He believed in honor and duty while the world was changing. The Duke of Ravenhill understands the future, and the future requires the treaty to burn and the vaults to open. He turned his gaze to Alistair. And you, the logical investigator. You found the fake. You found the monk. You even found the boy. I must admit, I am impressed. It's a pity you have to die in a hole. You're outnumbered, Julian, Alistair said, stepping in front of Ilara and Leo. The Marshal's men are spread thin, and the Royal Vanguard will be looking for the King's nephew. Julian laughed, a high, cold sound that made the hair on Alistair's neck stand up. Outnumbered. Look behind you, Alistair. Alistair didn't turn, but he heard the steel being drawn. From the dark alcoves of the dead lords, 3 figures emerged. They weren't soldiers. They were the shadows, the elite assassins of Julian's private circle. They wore black leather and carried curved blades that didn't reflect the light. The Marshal is a fool, Julian said, checking his fingernails. He thinks he's in charge. But he works for me. Everyone works for me, eventually. Not me. Leo squeaked, suddenly lunging forward and throwing a handful of soot into the eyes of the nearest assassin. The darkness erupted into chaos. Alistair parried a strike from a curved blade, the force of the blow vibrating up his arm. He grabbed Ilara's hand. Run for the stairs. Leo, follow her. What about the seal? Ilara shouted over the clash of steel. I have it. Alistair yelled, kicking over the lantern. The crypt plummeted into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the sparks of clashing blades. Alistair fought like a man possessed, using the master key in his left hand as a makeshift dagger. He felt the cold sting of a blade across his ribs. But he didn't stop. He pushed the heavy iron pedestal over, creating a barricade. Get them! Julian screamed, his voice losing its composure. Kill them all and bring me the gold. Alistair found the secret door the lady had shown him. He shoved Ilara and Leo through and slammed the iron bolt home just as a heavy blow struck the other side. They were safe for a moment, but they were trapped in a vertical chimney that led not to the castle, but to the outer cliffs of the mountain. The chimney was a vertical throat of jagged stone, slick with the condensation of 1,000 years. Sir Alistair led the way, his fingers raw and bleeding as he found purchase in the narrow crevices. Below him, he could hear Leo's panicked, ragged breathing and the steady, rhythmic scrape of Lady Ilara's boots. The darkness was absolute, save for the faint, ghostly blue glow emanating from the true golden seal tucked against Alistair's chest. Don't look down, Leo. Alistair hissed, his voice echoing upward. Focus on the stone in front of you. Think of the forge. Think of the rhythm of the hammer. It's too high, sir. The boy whimpered, his voice trembling. The mountain is swallowing us. The mountain is protecting us. Ilara countered from below. Her voice was surprisingly strong, forged in the fires of the last few hours. Julian's men are heavy with armor and arrogance. They cannot follow where the wind goes. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner and biting cold. The smell of damp earth was replaced by the sharp, metallic scent of snow. Suddenly, the vertical shaft ended, opening into a narrow horizontal crawl space. Alistair pulled himself through, then reached back to haul Leo and Ilara up into the cramped tunnel. They crawled for what felt like miles, the stone ceiling pressing against their backs. Finally, a glimmer of moonlight appeared at the end of the passage. Alistair emerged first, stepping out onto a narrow ledge that clung to the sheer face of the Iron Mountain like a frozen tear. The sight was breathtaking and terrifying. Below them, the world was a swirling vortex of white and grey. Thousands of feet down, the campfires of the Duke of Ravenhill's army looked like embers in a dying fire. The fortress of the Iron Gate was visible to their left, a dark, hulking shadow against the snow. "We're outside," Leo whispered, shivering violently as the wind tore at his soot-stained tunic. Alistair looked at the ledge. It was barely 2 feet wide and covered in a treacherous layer of black ice. One wrong step meant a fall into the abyss. He looked back at the tunnel entrance. A faint scratching sound came from within. "They're coming," Alistair said, his hand going to his sword. "Julian's shadows. They don't need light to hunt. We can't fight them here," Ilara said, looking at the ledge that disappeared around the curve of the mountain. "There is a path, an old hermit's trail, that leads to the Falcon's Nest. It's a hidden watchtower built into the peak. If we can reach it, we can signal the king's true loyalists." "How far?" Alistair asked, his eyes scanning the darkness for movement. "Far enough to die a dozen times over," Ilara replied, wrapping her torn cloak around her. "But it's the only way down that doesn't lead back into the Marshal's arms." Alistair nodded. He took a length of rope from his pack and tied it around his waist, then to Leo, and finally to Ilara. "We move as one. If one falls, we all hold the weight. Do you understand?" They nodded. With the wind screaming in their ears and the abyss yawning at their feet, they began the treacherous trek across the face of the world. The ledge was a nightmare of frozen stone. Every step was a gamble with gravity. Sir Alistair led the way, using his sword as a makeshift ice axe to test the ground before stepping. The rope between them stayed taut, a lifeline in a world of white noise and vertical death. Suddenly, a black shape detached itself from the tunnel mouth behind them. It moved with a fluid, terrifying grace, leaping onto the ledge with the silence of a hunting owl. It was one of Julian's shadows, his curved blade glinting with a dull, oily sheen. "Go!" Alistair roared, shoving Leo and Ilara forward. "Move toward the curve. Don't look back." Alistair turned to face the assassin. On this narrow ledge, there was no room for fancy footwork or complex parries. It was a battle of balance and nerves. The shadow hissed, a sound that wasn't entirely human, and lunged. Alistair didn't swing his sword. Instead, he waited until the last possible second and dropped to his knees. The assassin, committed to his leap, sailed over Alistair's head. For a moment, the shadow hung in the air, his fingers clawing at the empty wind, before he disappeared into the white void without a single cry. But there were more. 2 more shadows emerged from the tunnel, their eyes glowing with a faint, unnatural green light. "They're using night sight," Alistair muttered, his breath coming in short, frozen gasps. He reached into his pouch and pulled out the last of Silas's smoke powder. He didn't throw it at the assassins. He threw it at the ledge beneath them. The small explosion didn't break the stone, but it shattered the layer of ice, sending a cloud of stinging white dust into the air. The shadows hesitated, their sensitive eyes overwhelmed by the sudden flash and debris. Alistair used the moment to retreat. He scrambled around the curve of the mountain, his boots slipping on the rubble. He found Ilara and Leo huddled against the rock face where the ledge widened slightly into a natural alcove. "Are you hurt?" Ilara asked, her eyes searching his. "I'm alive," Alistair said, his side throbbing where the previous wound had reopened. "But they won't stop. Julian wants that seal more than he wants his own soul." "Look," Leo whispered, pointing upward. Above them, carved into a natural cleft in the peak, was a structure of ancient timber and stone. It looked like a bird's nest made for a giant. This was the Falcon's Nest. It was an impossible piece of architecture, hanging over the edge of the world. "The ladder," Ilara said, pointing to a series of iron rungs bolted into the rock. "It leads to the signal fire." As they began to climb, the first of the shadows rounded the curve. The assassin paused, looking up at his prey. He didn't follow them onto the ladder. Instead, he reached into his belt and pulled out a small, collapsible crossbow. A bolt whistled past Alistair's ear, thudding into the wood of the tower above. "Hurry!" Alistair urged, pushing Leo up the rungs. "Into the tower. Now!" The interior of the falcon's nest was surprisingly warm, shielded from the wind by thick walls of mountain cedar and stone. It was a circular room filled with ancient maps, rusted spyglasses, and a large, unlit pyre of wood in the center of the floor. Sir Alistair barred the heavy trapdoor, listening as the shadow's bolts thudded into the wood from below. "We're trapped," Leo said, sinking to the floor. "They'll just wait for us to freeze or starve." "No," Ilara said, walking to the center of the room. She looked at the golden seal, which Alistair had placed on a stone table. The blue glow was brighter now, pulsing like a living heart. "The seal isn't just a key to the vault. It's a key to the truth." Alistair watched as Ilara took a small, silver mirror from the wall and angled it so the moonlight from a high window hit the crystal core of the seal. The room was suddenly filled with light. Not just blue light, but a cascade of colors that projected images onto the wooden walls. It was a map, but not of the Iron Gate. It was a map of the capital, showing secret tunnels that led directly beneath the king's throne room. "The treaty isn't in the vault," Alistair whispered, his eyes wide. "The treaty is the source of the vault's power." Silas didn't just build locks. He built a system to protect the very foundation of the law. As the light shifted, words appeared in the air, written in the same elegant script Alistair had seen in the library. "The blood of the king is the lock. The truth of the line is the key. Beware the serpent who seeks the crown, for his venom is the death of the law." "It's a warning," Ilara said, her voice trembling. "Julian isn't just trying to open a vault. He's trying to destroy the evidence of his own illegitimacy. He isn't the king's nephew. He's a pretender, a child of the south brought in to destabilize the north." Alistair looked at the golden seal. The crystal was vibrating now, and he realized it was reacting to the proximity of the shadows outside. The green light of the assassins was a corruption of the same energy that powered the seal. "If we can light the signal fire," Alistair said, "the royal vanguard will see it. But the light will also show Julian exactly where we are. We have to light it," Ilara said, picking up a flint. "The truth is worth the risk." Alistair looked at the map on the wall. He saw something else, a hidden path that led from the falcon's nest directly down into the hidden valley, a place where the Duke's army would never think to look. "Light the fire, my lady," Alistair said, drawing his sword and standing over the trapdoor. "I will hold the ladder. Leo, get the rope ready. We're going to take a leap of faith." As the first sparks caught the dry wood of the pyre, the trapdoor beneath Alistair's feet began to groan under the weight of the shadows. The final battle for the Iron Gate was no longer about a fortress. It was about the soul of the kingdom itself. The signal fire roared to life, a pillar of orange and gold that defied the oppressive grey of the mountain peak. It wasn't just wood and pitch. The ancient cedar of the falcon's nest burned with a fierce, unnatural intensity, fueled by the proximity of the golden seal. From miles away, the beacon would look like a new star birthed upon the Iron Mountain. "The vanguard will see it," Ilara shouted over the flames. "They have to see it." Below them, the trapdoor shuddered under a massive blow. The iron bolt Alistair had set began to bend. He stood over it, legs braced, his sword held in a low guard. He could hear the shadows hissing to one another, sounds that were more beast than man. "Leo, the rope," Alistair commanded. "Tie it to the main support beam. We don't have much time." The boy scrambled to obey, his soot-stained hands trembling as he looped the thick hempen cord around the ancient pillar. Suddenly, the trapdoor exploded upward in a shower of splinters. The first shadow surged through, his green-glow eyes fixed on the golden seal. Alistair didn't wait for the assassin to land. He lunged, his blade catching the shadow in mid-air. The steel bit deep, but the assassin didn't cry out. He simply dissolved into a cloud of foul-smelling black smoke. "They aren't men," Leo screamed, backing away. "They are sorcery. They're Julian's playthings." Alistair gritted his teeth as two more figures emerged from the hole. The room was now a chaotic blend of blinding orange firelight and shifting black shadows. Alistair fought with a desperation he had never known. He was no longer just an investigator. He was the shield of a kingdom. He used the stone table as a barrier, parrying the curved blades that sought his life. The golden seal, sitting on the table, began to pulse in rhythm with the fire. Every time Alistair's sword clashed with the shadows, the seal emitted a shockwave of blue light. The light seemed to burn the assassins, peeling away their dark veils to reveal the withered, grey husks of men underneath. The light, Ilara realized, holding the silver mirror high. Alistair, drive them toward the fire. Understanding her plan, Alistair changed his tactics. He stopped defending and began to attack, his strikes heavy and relentless. He forced the remaining shadows back toward the central pyre. As the blue light of the seal combined with the heat of the beacon, the assassins shrieked, a sound like metal tearing, and vanished into the updraft of the flames. "The trapdoor won't hold the rest," Alistair said, breathless, as he saw more green eyes appearing in the darkness below. "The rope, now." He grabbed the golden seal and shoved it into his tunic. He helped Ilara over the railing of the balcony. Then Leo. They were suspended over a drop of 3,000 feet, with nothing but a rope and the howling wind between them and the rocks. "Jump," Alistair urged as the first of Julian's human guards burst into the room. They slid down the rope, the friction burning through Alistair's leather gloves. Above them, the falcon's nest began to crumble as the intense heat of the beacon weakened the ancient wood. As they reached the end of the rope and dropped into a deep drift of soft snow on a lower ledge, the tower exploded in a final, spectacular burst of light, sending the shadows and the traitors into the abyss. The hidden valley was a world tucked away from the maps of men. Shielded by the towering peaks of the Iron Mountains, it was a place where the snow lay in pristine, undisturbed sheets and the air was strangely still. Sir Alistair led the small group through the waist-deep powder, his eyes constantly scanning the ridges above. "We're behind them now," Ilara whispered, her breath hitching in the cold. "The Duke's army is on the southern slopes. They'll be watching the gates, not the cliffs." "But Julian won't stop," Alistair cautioned. "He saw the signal. He knows we survived the nest." They moved through a forest of frozen pines, their branches sagging under the weight of the winter. Every snap of a twig sounded like a bone breaking in the silence. Leo walked in the center, his small frame nearly swallowed by the shadows of the trees. He clutched a small iron poker he had salvaged from the tower, his only weapon against the darkness. "Wait." Alistair signaled for them to crouch. In the clearing ahead, a campfire flickered. It wasn't the large, rowdy camp of an army, but a small, disciplined fire. 4 horses were tethered nearby, their coats groomed and their saddles bearing the silver lion of the king. "The vanguard," Leo whispered, hope flickering in his eyes. "Or a trap," Alistair said. He crept forward, his hand on the hilt of his sword. As he reached the edge of the light, he saw a man sitting by the fire, polishing a silver helm. It was the High Marshal's second-in-command, Commander Cale. He was a man Alistair had known years ago, a soldier of unquestionable honor. Alistair stepped into the light. "Commander." Cale spun around, his sword half-drawn, before his eyes widened in recognition. "Sir Alistair. We saw the beacon." The Marshal said it was a trick of the Duke, but I remembered the old stories of the Falcon's Nest. "The Marshal is compromised," Kale, Alistair said, his voice hard. The first vanguard is filled with Julian's men. You are sitting in a nest of vipers. Kale looked at the men around the fire. They were his own soldiers, men he had trained. Surely not all of them. Not all. Alistair said, stepping closer. But enough to kill the king. I have the proof. The golden seal has revealed the truth of Julian's blood. He is a pretender. Kale. A pawn of the south. Kale's face went pale. He looked at the royal seal on Alistair's ring, then at Lady Alara as she emerged from the trees. He fell to one knee. If what you say is true, then the Iron Gate has already fallen to a silent enemy. My lady, my sword is yours. We need to reach the High Marshal before Julian does. Alara said, if the army follows the pretender, the kingdom is lost. The Marshal is at the southern overlook. Kale said, standing up. He's preparing for the final assault on the Duke's camp. But Julian is with him. They are inseparable. Then we go to the overlook. Alistair said, mounting one of the tethered horses, and we bring the light of the seal to the darkness of the command tent. The southern overlook was a natural platform of rock that gave a commanding view of the entire valley. In the center stood the High Marshal's command tent, a massive structure of blue silk and gold trim. Outside, the royal knights stood in rigid formations, their spears glinting in the morning sun. Sir Alistair, Alara, and Kale rode into the camp with the boldness of those who have nothing left to lose. The guards leveled their spears, but Kale's presence gave them pause. Stand aside. Kale roared. I bring the Lady of the Iron Gate and the King's Investigator. They dismounted and strode into the tent. Inside, High Marshal Valerus was leaning over a map, his face etched with worry. Standing beside him, draped in his crimson cloak, was Lord Julian. Dr. Vane stood in the shadows, his arm still in a sling, his eyes burning with a hateful fire. So, Julian said, his voice like silk over a blade, the ghosts have returned from the mountain. I must say, Alistair, your persistence is quite annoying. Marshal Valerus. Alistair shouted, ignoring Julian. Look at the man beside you. Look at the ring on his finger. Valerus looked up, confused. Alistair, what is the meaning of this? Julian is the king's blood. He is our hope for the future. He is a lie. Alistair pulled the golden seal from his tunic. The crystal was glowing with a fierce, steady light. The seal only responds to the true blood of the north. When I pricked my finger, it opened. When I held it near Julian's shadows, it burned them. Alistair stepped toward Julian. Hold the seal. My lord. If you are who you say you are, the crystal will shine for you. If not, it will show us the serpent underneath. Julian stepped back, his face contorting. This is madness. A child's toy used as a trial. Marshal, arrest this man. He has stolen the crown's property. But Valerus was no longer looking at the map. He was looking at the seal. He was looking at the way the light danced in the room, reflecting off the silver lion on his own chest. He looked at Julian's hand, the serpent ring with the green eyes. The serpent. Valerus whispered. He remembered the old prophecies of the court. The snake shall wear the lion's skin until the sun reveals the scale. Julian, show him your hand. I will do no such thing. Julian snarled. He reached for his sword, but Alistair was faster. With a movement born of weeks of survival, Alistair struck, not with a sword, but with the golden seal itself. He pressed the glowing crystal against Julian's chest. A scream erupted from Julian's throat, a sound that was not human. The crimson cloak withered. The handsome face of the prince began to peel away like wet parchment, revealing a grey, gaunt visage underneath. The emerald eyes of the serpent ring shattered, releasing a foul black mist. Sorcery! Valerus roared, drawing his sword. The first vanguard. To me. Dr. Vane lunged from the shadows with a hidden blade, but Commander Kale intercepted him, his heavy broadsword shearing through the physician's shoulder. Vane fell, his blood black and steaming on the rug. The royal knights outside, those branded with the Red Hawk, heard the scream and rushed the tent. But the spell was broken. The light of the true golden seal was radiating through the silk walls, and the soldiers who were not corrupted by the Duke's gold saw the truth. They saw their marshal standing over a monster. For the king. Valerus's voice shook the very mountain. The battle in the camp was short and brutal. Without the magical mask of Julian, the traitors lost their nerve. One by one, they were cut down or surrendered. Alistair stood over the slumped form of the thing that had been Julian. It wasn't a man at all, but a skinwalker, a creature of the deep south bound by the Duke's sorcery. The real Julian had likely died years ago. It's over, Alistair, Ilara said, placing a hand on his shoulder. Not quite, Alistair said, looking at the golden seal. The crystal was dimming, its energy spent. The Duke is still in the valley, and we still have a gate to protect. The Duke of Ravenhill was not a man of patience. From his position in the valley below, he had watched the falcon's nest burn and seen the shifting lights of the golden seal. When the magical veil over the camp at the southern overlook shattered, he knew his gamble had failed. The skinwalker was dead or captured. If the gate will not open from within, the Duke roared to his commanders, then we shall tear it from the mountain's face. The final assault began under the grey light of a winter dawn. Massive trebuchets, dragged through the snow at great cost, began to hurl boulders at the iron gate's outer walls. The sound was like thunder trapped in a box. Inside the fortress, the stones groaned, but they did not break. However, Alistair knew that even the strongest wall has a limit. The marshal is holding the ridge, Alistair said to Ilara as they raced back toward the gear room. But the Duke has 3,000 men. They'll swarm the base of the mountain. We need something more than swords. The heart, Ilara said, her breath misting in the cold. My father once told me that the Iron Gate was built on a series of ancient steam vents. Silas worked on the pressure valves for years. He called it the mountain's breath. Alistair understood. The clockwork mechanisms he had seen weren't just for moving gears. They were for controlling the geothermal energy of the mountain itself. He reached the central pedestal in the gear room, where Marek had died. He looked at the golden seal in his hand. Leo! To the secondary valves! Alistair shouted. The boy, now a veteran of the long night, ran to the copper pipes lining the walls. Alistair inserted the golden seal into the pedestal, but instead of turning it to the right to open the gate, he pushed it down and twisted it to the left. The master key, still in his other hand, acted as a stabilizer. Deep beneath them, the mountain began to growl. The floor grew hot beneath their boots. On the slopes outside, the Duke's men screamed as jets of superheated steam erupted from hidden fissures in the rock. The snow turned to a blinding white mist. The path to the gate became an impassable wall of heat and fog. The Duke's vanguard, caught in the mountain's breath, broke and fled. The siege engines, their wooden frames warped by the heat and moisture, collapsed into the slush. The Iron Gate had defended itself. Alistair leaned against the pedestal, the golden seal cooling in his hand. The mountain's growl faded into a satisfied purr. The siege was over. Spring arrived late to the Iron Mountains, but when it came, it was beautiful. The white drifts melted into rushing crystal streams, and the first green shoots of the Devil's Breath flowers, now carefully managed by a new, loyal herbalist, peeked through the thawing mud. The High Marshal had stayed through the winter to clear the valley of the Duke's stragglers. The Duke of Ravenhill had escaped into the south, but his power was broken, his sorcery revealed, and his lands seized by the crown. Sir Alistair stood in the courtyard of the Iron Gate, his horse packed and ready for the long journey back to the capital. He wore a new cloak, a gift from the lady of the castle, embroidered with a small, subtle falcon. Lady Alara walked beside him. She looked older, her face no longer that of a frightened daughter, but of a ruler. In her hand, she carried a heavy parchment, the Treaty of the Three Realms. Alistair had found it hidden behind the sarcophagus of Lord Alaric. It was safe now, its secrets protected by the law. The king has confirmed your title, my lady, Alistair said, smiling. Lady Ilara, Warden of the Iron Gate. It has a fine ring to it. I could use a chief investigator, she said, her voice teasing but with a hint of hope. The mountains are still full of shadows, Alistair, and the clockwork heart needs a steady hand. Alistair looked at the high peaks. Part of him wanted to stay, to lose himself in the logic of the gears and the quiet of the library. But he was the king's man, and there were other mysteries waiting in the crowded streets of the capital. Leo will stay, Alistair said, gesturing to the boy, who was now dressed in a clean leather apron, helping a new blacksmith at the forge. He knows the mountain better than anyone now. He will keep the heart beating. Alistair mounted his horse. He looked at the golden seal, now returned to its velvet box in Alara's care. He had come to the Iron Gate to solve a murder in a locked room. He left having saved a kingdom from a serpent. Logic is a powerful tool, my lady, Alistair said as he turned his horse toward the gate. But I have learned that truth requires a little bit of blood and a lot of heart. He raised a hand in farewell and rode out through the massive stone archway. The Iron Gate stood tall behind him, no longer a tomb or a trap, but a beacon of the north. The mystery was closed, the story was told, and the investigator was already looking toward the next horizon.